Okay, so welcome guys. Welcome to my little demonstration here. So when I combine all of what I learned into this to make this method, this is what results in how I learn Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques.
5 minutes later.
But yeah, guys, this is how I memorize the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques right here. It literally just looks like this. Like it's all coded and it's all associated to this video. This is what literally helps me memorize as much information as I can get from this tutorial, and it really just sinks right in. Skip to this part of the video if you just want to get to the point of how my method works. This first part of the video from here is just all about my background and perspectives in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, as well as mostly my reasons and my motivations for creating such a method. So with that, this is what I did and why I did to make memorizing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques easier and to work for a lazy bum like myself, who couldn't bother to drill or show up appropriately enough to train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu at my gym. This method, or whatever I made, ended up helping me improve my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in a way that fits my lifestyle, the lifestyle of a lazy person. Almost 2 to 3 years of struggling as a white belt who had problems keeping up with class, always forgetting what I learned, and feeling like I was always stuck not progressing and getting any better. This method was my hack to solve those issues of me being too lazy to put in the work, and made me go from a struggling white belt to a not so struggling white belt. So again, before we get started, here is a little background of myself in my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu career. I only have somewhat on and off of almost 7 years of experience with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu so far. For this video, I am not here to give any jiu-jitsu advice. I am only still a white belt as of this moment. If you ask me why after 7 years on white belt, well, that's because the gym that I have committed most of my loyalty to does testing, where in order to meet the standards of what's required for you to progress in each belt level, there are a series of tests that you have to study for and pass. Example, if you are a white belt trying to get to your blue belt, in order to do so, for this stage, you have to memorize techniques on the curriculum, which is around 150 fundamentals and basic techniques. Once you finally do, then you have to schedule a day where you have to demonstrate it all in front of everyone, pass the test, then you can finally earn your blue belt. No exceptions. So it doesn't matter how long you've been doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, if you are trying to get a blue belt from Coach J, he will not give you even a single stripe if you don't take the test and pass it. I think I heard a rumor that we had a guy who did Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for 15 years and that he was still a stripeless white belt at the gym. And this is all because he hasn't taken the test. But fortunately, later on, he finally did take the test and became a blue belt. So yeah, my coach doesn't play around. You are responsible for your own training. And if you are really serious and determined to progress in the school, then aiming to pass these tests are the goal. For me, I don't know when I will take it. I always feel anxious when it comes to tests, but we will see. Because people I met and rolled with so far think I am sandbagging and telling me that I need to get my blue belt. And yeah, it would be nice to finally get my blue belt at this point. But honestly, throughout my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu journey till now, I was not really too concerned of my belt rank. As long as I keep seeing my skills in grappling getting better, or just being able to have fun with grappling in general, I don't really care about my belt rank that much. But we'll definitely consider someday to try to take that blue belt test. But in overall, the main focus for this video, I am only here to share my experience and how I decided to take responsibility for how I train my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and the way I did it, that I think it's unique enough to share. But overall, take everything I say with a grain of salt. Now, with that out of the way, let's get started. Overall, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was difficult to learn. Back when I first started Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, the main issue was that I kept on forgetting techniques. I always keep forgetting them, especially after every class. For example, it's always frustrating on how one day I show up to class, I get taught a set of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques for an hour, and somehow the next day after, I completely forget them, and it keeps happening. But I know the reasons why, cause one, I have a terrible memory skills during that time. Also, when it comes to learning, if I am consistent with my learning in trying to obtain a new skill, I would consider myself to be a slow learner overall. Again, that's if I am consistent. But when it comes to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, what makes it even worse is that I have a bizarre Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu schedule of only showing up to class barely 2 times a week, which is not consistent enough and doesn't help if I want to retain and build knowledge of what I learned from those classes. Especially in the first year I started training Jiu-Jitsu at age 21 in 2017. Again, you remember how I told you that in order to go from white belt to blue belt is that you have to memorize and learn around 150 basics and fundamental techniques. My gym's dogma and standards is that you are not considered a blue belt until you know them all and can perform them physically well enough. The strong belief of why my gym does it this way is that it is supposed to lay a solid foundation of having enough knowledge built to then start refining and connecting them all together later on as you progress and going for the next level of belts. A lot of people say it is the hardest phase of going from white belt to blue belt. The reasons why? Well, because you are in a phase where you start off not knowing anything, have no idea what you're doing, and you got to build from there. This phase is all about you getting beaten up all the time in rollings, and a whole bunch of new, complicated information is just being thrown at you, overloading your brain all the time. Chaotic, and you are just trying to make sense of it all. But as long as you are consistent and put effort, with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, it might take a while for you to get used to it, but eventually with the effort and all the hard work you put in, you will eventually reach a level in your Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu of earning your blue belt, which is a signifier that you have finally have your foot through the door. This process from white belt to blue belt is what I like to call the white belt phase at my gym. A metaphor for what I like to use is that if Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was like a video game, then the white belt phase is the tutorial that you have to go through in order to get ready to start playing the actual game. Tutorial phase are really annoying, but it is necessary to do to teach you the mechanics of how the buttons of what your controller does, all the rules, and essentially get you ready to know how to actually play the game so that your experience can be more efficient, enjoyable, and rewarding throughout the rest of the game. In case of the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu tutorial white belt phase at my gym, it is a really difficult phase because you have to spend this whole tutorial phase building and establishing a solid foundation. Just like building a house requires a solid foundation, learning the basics and fundamentals in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu ensures that practitioners have a strong base to build upon. Once you establish a foundation that is considered solid enough, when it finally comes to learning and adding advanced techniques, which are often variations or combinations of basic movements and fundamental concepts. So without a good understanding of the fundamentals and basics, it's challenging to progress effectively. Memorizing and learning those fundamentals and basics techniques are crucial, and there are around 150 of them at my gym. Most people can get stuck in this phase. How long you're stuck in the white belt tutorial phase all depends on many factors, but with all things considered, I think they say it takes the average person about 2 to 4 years at my gym to memorize and learn those fundamentals and basics in order to build the foundation. But anyhow, once you can finally memorize those 150 basics and fundamentals and prove you can do them all well enough at my gym, you're considered a blue belt. Not just by rank, but also when it comes to your skills correlating being worthy as a blue belt. Because building knowledge with practice comes skills, and that foundation that's been built goes a long way. For me, my perspectives or definition of how I see the signs that you are out of the white belt phase is that you can handle rolling with most white belts and some blue belts with ease, are able to focus on applying fundamentals and basics instead of spasming. And with that, you're out of the white belt tutorial phase. You are in a level where you feel self-sufficient enough that the world of jiu-jitsu starts opening up and you can actually start playing the actual game of progressing and sharpening your skills. Though no one at my gym calls this the white belt tutorial phase, to me, for the sake of writing this essay and proving some of my points, I just think that is a perfect name that I can think of, that I see fit. Personally, because I like video games and want to relate to everything I do. Again, what I learned over time is that a lot of people are usually overwhelmed and get stuck in this phase. I know I was, cause come on coach, you really think I can make the time and put effort into memorizing all this shit? I got a life to live, you know. 2 to 4 years to do all this work seems like a long time for me. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is considered one of the most difficult martial arts to master, with a progression that can feel slow and frustrating. Unlike striking arts, where individuals may have some intuitive understanding of how to punch or kick, grappling and the technical nuances of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu do not come naturally to most people. This steep learning curve can lead to discouragement, especially when progress feels slow or when faced with frequent experience of tapping out to more experienced practitioners. This is probably the reasons why throughout the years that I have been doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I experienced seeing a lot of other people struggle and quit before getting their blue belt. The feeling of lack of progress or plateaus can definitely get to a lot of practitioners who feel that they are not making progress or have hit a plateau in their learning. This can be particularly disheartening and lead to a loss of motivation, which can result in people quitting. I personally think that I quit like 4 or 10 times throughout my chaotic 7 years of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. In Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, there is an importance of what's required to effectively learn the art that most people try to subconsciously avoid understanding but end up realizing later on down the line, and that is the crucial importance of putting effort and focus in acquiring as much knowledge on the fundamentals and basics when first starting Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. First thing you should do out of the get-go is to hammer all of those basics and fundamentals into your brain. If you don't, well, the saying goes for doing anything when it comes to knowledge and understanding of things. If you don't know what you are doing, you are going to eventually have a bad time. Keep it up and you are going to have a bad time all the time. Either quit like most people or fix your mistakes and build enough knowledge to have a better time. I think getting into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is like getting into swimming. If you don't learn enough of the fundamentals and basics in order to build a solid foundation of swimming from the beginning first, and always just jump in the water head first, hoping for the best all the time, you are gonna drown every time. And is drowning fun? Are you here to just drown? No. You are here for swimming, but you can't start swimming effectively unless you learn those fundamentals and basics first. Keep on ignoring them, keep on drowning. Simple as that. That was sort of what I interpret from the people who are higher belts at my gym, who literally kept telling me to do just that, is to work on those fundamentals and basics, memorize them all so that eventually I can reach to a level of finally establishing my foundation. And from there, I will truly start to see what Jiu-Jitsu is all about. But in order to memorize these basics and fundamentals, one of the most popular methods that most Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioners use to memorize Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques is by drilling. Drilling in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu refers to the practice of repeatedly executing a specific technique or series of moves with the aim of ingraining it into muscle memory. This method of training is crucial in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as it helps practitioners refine their skills, improve their reaction times, and better understand the mechanics and timing of techniques. Drilling in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is mostly done with a partner or with the use of training aids like grappling dummies, but the most efficient way is with a partner. As a beginner back then, I was told that I have to drill almost every day. Drill a technique until it is engraved into memory, which could take hundreds of repetitions, as well as with the combination of showing up at least 5 times a week at my gym for classes. I needed to do it if I want to quickly get out of this Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu white belt tutorial phase. But did I listen? No. To me, that all sounded like too much work. Since the beginning of joining my gym, all I wanted was to approach my training more casually and whenever I feel like it. But eventually I started to realize that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is a sport not friendly to people trying to approach things casually or in a low effort way. Personally, I think for me, I wasn't aiming to be an advanced grappler or anything like that. I just wanted to get casually good at it. In definition by casually good in my own terms, it means I am just trying to get to a level where it is satisfying and rewarding enough to do to enjoy the sport as a hobby for the long run, as a form of leisure. Like any other hobbies I have done before Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I thought I would be able to reach that state with BJJ eventually, with a low effort or casual approach away. But I was wrong, because I eventually realized the importance and how crucial it is to tackle in building a solid foundation in BJJ really is. Here's what I mean. When learning any type of skill, focusing on building a solid foundation first before anything would be the key to long-term enjoyment and progression for that skill. In any type of hobby or sport, whether it is cognitively demanding that has you constantly thinking, analyzing, calculating, remembering, reasoning, and memorizing, like learning how to play chess, math, or speaking a different language. Then we have things that are physically demanding that has you pushing your body's physical capabilities and endurance, like weightlifting, calisthenics, and marathon running. The length of time to build enough of a solid foundation in any of these categories will depend on many different variables. But I believe if we go down to the core of what is the most important variables to consider that plays a heavy role in giving higher chances of achieving favorable outcomes, is how much effort and consistency that a person is willing or required to give, and also how much mental effort are they willing to invest and endure in order to do so. What I mean by mental effort or endurance is that how much are you willing to endure doing of what's required to achieve a certain goal, level of skill, or desired behavior. You know, a fun example would be fighting the urge to not quit your miserable job, work through it, and finally get that sweet paycheck. I gotta quit my job. Anyways, let's explain more about these cognitive categories that I have listed first. Overall, they don't require any much physical effort at all to do. So let's start with chess. To reach a basic level of competency, understanding, opening principles, basic tactics, and some common checkmating patterns might take a few weeks to a few months of regular study and practice. Cognitive effort, mental effort, and consistency can be light to moderate because of how convenient and beginner-friendly chess can be to help achieve that point. Don't get me wrong, chess can be extremely mentally and cognitively taxing once you go deeper within the game to become a pro or master level. But for beginners, I don't think it is really that mentally taxing to just focus on acquiring a solid foundation overall. Typically, a complete beginner can grasp the basic rules, such as how pieces move, the concepts of check, checkmate, and stalemate within a few hours or days of practice. In a way, you can quickly go through the basic rules to start experimenting some plays, and from there, you can just start having fun right away while working on towards building a solid foundation. Now, with building a solid foundation in math, which is something called learning algebra, because if you don't know, algebra is considered the fundamental and basic aspects of math that once you learn would be enough for you to actually start to apply in real everyday life. It is your key gateway in building a strong mathematical base. The time to cover all of algebra for the average person would probably be a couple of months. I give it a light to moderate cognitive effort, mental effort, and consistency to do, because math's entryway to start learning I find to be pretty friendly towards beginners because of how structured and intuitive it can be. Also, math can be convenient to practice anywhere and anytime. And yes, math can be mentally and cognitively taxing if you are going in deeper to calculus, physics, and beyond into solving very complex problems that unless you are planning to be a rocket scientist one day, you're definitely not going to use it in your everyday life. But again, to just learn enough to build a basic solid foundation to start off is not that bad and can be achievable to most people as long as they are consistent with it. Next is learning to speak a different language. This could take 6 months to a year to build a foundation in order to, let's say, be somewhat fluent of knowing enough to get by when traveling to another country. As a beginner, you probably have to put moderate to heavy cognitive effort as you are required to constantly make sure you are on top in being consistent with your studies and in getting a hold of the numerous fundamental parts of that language, which consists of learning the vocabulary, grammar, pronunciation, listening skills, practice speaking, and the context of that language. You really will have to structure and strategize a way to juggle in learning each of these parts effectively enough. If you want to build your foundation in that language, mental effort is probably going to be high because of how learning intensive and time intensive in acquiring a new language can be. Mental challenges are when you need to practice speaking to native speakers to test out what you know. And mental endurance is that you have to make sure to constantly make time to study it almost every day until it becomes reliable and ingrained enough that if you were thrown into another country, you could be confident enough to get by. Overall, from my experience, the entryway to start learning to acquire a new language for beginners is pretty hard. It can be mentally taxing and hard process to do in order to build a solid foundation. 6 months to a year to endure learning a new language will require patience and perseverance. I remember when I went to Vietnam and lived there for like 6 months. I took the opportunity to finally start learning Vietnamese because I was constantly surrounded by it all the time in Vietnam. And I can recall how many times each day I would be so mentally burnt out all the time from trying to practice speaking it to other people that I would need to constantly take breaks throughout each day. Imagine not being able to express yourself freely and connect to other people that well because of a language barrier. It just drove me crazy. In a way, I had to mentally survive, and in order to do that, one of the ways is that I would constantly try to shove as much vocabulary to my brain as much as I can every night to just make the next day easier and getting by. It was rough at first, but eventually it really helped me to progress fast. I can confidently say at this point, I can talk almost like a 7-year-old. Anyways, going off topic there. Now, when we compare to something like getting into physically demanding things that has you pushing your body's physical capabilities and endurance like lifting weights, calisthenics, or marathon running, I would say a moderate to high level of physical and mental effort will be required for new beginners in these categories, but not cognitive effort as much because I think understanding the motion of pushing and pulling weights, especially in weightlifting, can come quickly and naturally to most people. Also, most people intuitively will know how to start running and will most likely know how to perform a push-up on the first time they see it. Overall, you don't need to start thinking as much cognitively once you start practicing and experimenting around. Eventually, finding your footing to get used to a certain routine and build a good understanding of correct safe ways to lift or work out effectively. The consistency of doing it almost every day will be required a lot at the beginning, but will get easier once you establish your solid foundation. If we are just mainly going off from mostly learning the physical training aspects of things and acquiring some basic understanding of the diet part of fitness as well, overall, they say on average, it is probably going to take 3 months to get through and building your solid foundation of having enough basic knowledge and get those newbie gains, which would result in you to acquire a newfound ego boost or feeling proud and motivated with the results enough to keep going and improve from there. Now, with all that consideration out of the way, when it finally comes to learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as an entryway for new beginners to start building a solid foundation, coming from my experience, going in as a new beginner, I eventually saw it to be the most mentally, cognitively, and physically demanding thing that I had to face so far. Because if I want to reach to a level to see what Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is truly all about and become good at it enough in order to actually enjoy the sport for the long run, to do so, my solid foundation needed to be built first, and it was a frustrating struggle for me to do so. The majority of consensus is that it takes the average person 2 to 4 years with a certain appropriate amount of consistency, commitment, and effort to build that solid foundation. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is not convenient to learn anytime and anywhere you want. Will require you to always go to an ideal environment or place in order to actually practice the art effectively. And you will have to constantly make sure you are on top of your learning. What do I mean by with all that? From my experience of looking at the traditional route of building a solid foundation in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, when first starting out as a beginner white belt with no grappling experience, I realized whether if you are an on casual person trying to approach learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to just get moderately good at it, or a serious person aiming to be at the top of the sport, you need to establish a solid foundation first if you want to go anywhere with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Meaning, you need to build a solid base or platform of where you can reliably stand on and have a sense of control on your progression. And if you think showing up to the gym to take classes only 2 to 3 times a week consistently is enough to get you to eventually build your solid foundation, no, that is not enough. If you can do 5 times a week, that would be more ideal. But just showing up to classes is not enough. If you are not focused, committed, and putting enough effort in following up with what you learn by adding extra time to drill and work on techniques on top of that, then for a sport like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, approaching this sport in a way like that as a new beginner, unless you got photographic memory or something, it is going to be much harder to build and retain your knowledge in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu with that approach. And if you are starting out training a worser way like me, who barely show up 2 times a week and barely ever drill and work on techniques, just training here and there aimlessly, you are going to struggle, and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu will not be fun in the long run, but be a very frustrating experience. If you want to avoid the frustration and not be part of the large number of people that quit Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu every year, you gotta be serious and right away in the beginning as a new beginner grappler. Put in the work to memorize and know all those fundamentals and basic techniques first. Get that out of the way, because once you do successfully hammer all those down to your long-term memory by doing what's required of what I like to call the traditional way of following the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu rite of passage, which is preached and believed to be the ideal way by majority of professional Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioners, is that in order to build your solid foundation efficiently and quickly, the rule is that you show up at least 5 times a week consistently to your gym. Put effort in being focused to your training, as well as study and drill constantly as much as you can on the fundamentals and basics. Do this for about 2 to 4 years. As a result from taking the rite of passage of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, eventually, throughout all the effort and commitment, you should have built a solid foundation to a point where it is almost impossible to forget the fundamentals and basics, because you did them so many times throughout the years. Again, just like building a house, you need a solid foundation first. And one of the benefits of having a solid foundation is that even if you stop doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for a while to even years, the house of your skills may get decrepit and run down or even destroyed, but the foundation instinctively will almost always be there for you to rebuild a new house again, and be much easier in doing so. Building a foundation nowadays, if there is something you want to learn how to do or get into, no matter what it is, there is always some sort of fundamentals and basic criteria that's been developed, tested, and established as a foundation by many professionals and experienced people over many years as a way to help beginners to start building and following for a healthy long-term progression. With that foundation that beginners are able to successfully build, it will help enabling efficient and effective learning, developing critical skills, safety and injury prevention, and foster confidence and adaptability. It sets the stage for a lifelong learning and the ability to apply knowledge in a practical and innovative ways. There are subjects, jobs, skills, sports, and hobbies that are easy to build a foundation, and there are hard ones. And with something like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, building a foundation can be a challenge. But once you finally establish a foundation that is solid enough, at this point, you can now be a casual Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner and practice Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu casually, of showing up whenever you want. Can actually have fun in your roles and enjoy taking classes. You are essentially at a good stage in your Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu where you can have a sense of control in how deep you want to go with the sport. And again, even if you stop practicing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for a year or two, those fundamentals and basics that you work so hard to etch into your brain, they are always there for you to rely on to not fall back into being a complete newbie beginner again. And whenever you decide to start training again, you can effectively rebuild your skills way back up to where you left off easily. Like you stopped driving a car for 2 years. And when you finally get back on behind the wheel, sure, you're probably going to be rusty and probably not going to drift or speed over 100 miles an hour right away, but at least you still remember how to do a basic drive of getting to point A to B and remember all the rules of the road like it's natural common sense. To make my point from all of this, overall, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is not an easy sport to start learning or do for the average person. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu relies heavily in building a foundation first over anything else, which could take years to establish before actually playing the actual game. It's not simple as learning how to play pickleball for the first time, which you can probably build a foundation of learning all the fundamentals and basics within a day of practice. Probably the reasons why they call it the fastest growing sport, because it's easy to do and simple for beginners to get into. But with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, it's going to take some time, patience, and effort, because training in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is difficult and complex, effectively requires a significant amount of time and commitment that most people will find balancing training with personal, family, and work responsibilities can be an overall challenging in itself. So yes, the overall experience of doing the sport of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu will only get better and funner to do after spending 2 to 4 years of building your foundation, which not a lot of people can have the patience, time, and commitment to mentally endure for that long. I know I couldn't many times before. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu has been the type of sport that for a beginner with no grappling experience who are just starting off, it is not something you can do on and off whenever you want and expect results to come in from working like that. In order to build your foundation in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, it is more like the saying, striking the iron while it is hot. Once you start, you gotta keep striking and stay focused until it becomes the desired shape that you want. You can't just hit it a few times, then call it a day and come back to it later. If you do that, you run the risk of having to start the process all over again and will really never reach your desired outcome. I know I've been kind of repeatedly ranting around for a while now of how hard learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu can be, but in a way, it is my warning to all of you out there who are just getting into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and are still in that novel phase of experiencing a grappling art for the first time. Make sure you're up and at it with learning those fundamentals and basics, because once the novelty experience wears off and the feeling of struggle and frustration of not being able to progress and getting good at Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu sets in, then probably about 3 months I give it, high chance you might quit doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Trust me on this one. In my 7 years of experiencing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu so far at this point, I've seen it happen with myself and other people who have gone through that. Now, getting back to my experience as a beginner, what ended up happening since I didn't listen and do what was required to memorize the fundamental and basic techniques right off the bat? Again, in retrospect, worst choice that I did, by the way. For me, it ended up being pretty much hard to impossible to progress doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Memorizing and learning those techniques from classes with the way I was going about with my training was like trying to learn a language, but you just keep forgetting the vocabulary words. Then when it comes to rolling, I always kept on making the same mistakes over and over again, because how can I learn from my mistakes when I can't remember them? Overall, lots of struggle and it wasn't fun. So after over a year of struggle, having the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu mental burnout getting worse of feeling like I barely made any progress and still not being able to stick any much of the fundamentals and basic techniques satisfyingly enough to my brain, I just overall couldn't effectively build my foundation nor put in the actual effort to. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu became, in my eyes, a skill that just seemed to take forever to build a foundation and asking too much of what's required in order to do so for me. And I was questioning if Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu ever would mount to anything worth trying to continue on with. Deep down, I knew my lazy habit and training was most likely the culprit to everything, but I don't know what was I thinking at the time. I was just hoping some way that this lazy training of mine would work out somehow, but I kept on ignoring the only solution at the time that could solve my problem and help to finally progress in my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And that is to do what everyone has been telling me to do, is to take the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu rite of passage of showing up to class at least 5 times a week in order to have a healthy progression in my Jiu-Jitsu. Of course, using that time to drill and going over techniques with a partner or teacher and just participate in classes as much as I can, which in the perspective of things, again, I agree is the best solution because Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is a hard sport to get into. Time and effort is needed because again, for the average casual person who just wants to get casually good at it, work is needed to reach to that point. I needed to climb that steep mountain before things get easier. But I kept on not listening, since throughout my time with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu of ultimately not following the advice and just kept on lazy training, which resulted in plateaus and discouragement. I kept getting beaten up on the mats like a newbie all the time. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu started to become something I would avoid doing more and more. Fast forward to after about over 2 years of struggling to learn Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu at my gym, of still being stuck in my white belt tutorial phase, of still spasming on the mats and still not really retaining anything I learned. You think after over 2 years of this lazy training would yield some satisfying results, but nope. I reached to a point where I became very discouraged. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu mental burnout was an all-time high that eventually somewhere down the line I had enough and took a break from Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for a little while because I just felt like I was wasting my time and money. I wasn't feeling like I was improving anything. I just felt stupid the whole time training Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So going into this break of re-evaluating some of my priorities, rebuilding some motivation, and re-strategizing, I later came back after like 8 months to try Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu again because overall, I like the sport. I just want to finally get good enough to where I can look forward to show up to my gym and actually have fun and feel rewarded in doing so after. Coming back to my gym to train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu again, after almost a year break, I already knew that if I don't get my act together, for a lazy person like myself, if I want to improve in my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and finally build a foundation, I can't really approach trying to do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu half-heartedly of not putting much time and effort. Looking back on my first 2 years of training Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, of only showing up to class maybe 2 times a week, sometimes I wouldn't even show up for weeks, and also barely putting the time and effort to drill, which a reason why I kept neglecting to do because let's be real. In my first 2 years of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, usually when I show up to my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu school, I really don't want to bother with drilling because it's boring and I just want to jump straight into rolling because it's more funner. But later on, I realized rolling is not fun if I don't get better over time, and to make rolling even funner is that I needed to take more time and effort to memorize techniques to add to my arsenal, and that's by mostly drilling, which I kind of hate doing because again, it is so boring and frustrating to do. Back then, I felt it just doesn't feel rewarding enough, worth doing or spend my time on. Just letting you all know, I wasn't just a lazy guy, but also an impatient one as well, that wanted results to come quick from doing something. And since drilling is something that requires consistency, effort, planning, and patience to do to actually be effective in memorizing and learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques, in the end, it wasn't going to work out for me with the state of mind that I had. So you see the dilemma there with me when it comes to drilling. But at that time, coming back to train again after 8 months, I really wanted to get out of my gym's tutorial white belt phase that I have been stuck in. And it's sad that at that time in my life, after already almost 3 years gone by and still can't do or remember the basics or fundamentals proficiently enough, while other people who started the same time as me have already got it down, now beating me up with them on the mats and are quickly now advancing to blue belt. Can't complain because no shit. They worked hard to memorize those fundamentals and basics of doing what's required since the beginning, or realized and took action more earlier than me of what needs to be done in order to advance. To me, reflecting back on those first 2 years or so of failing my training, when I came back after the long break and started to train again, every time I would roll and get submitted and destroyed on the mats by people who started doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu the same time as me, it just became a constant reminder that I should have not have been lazy with my training and should have put in more effort since the beginning. Overall, it's just me feeling pretty much left behind in a way, like you got stuck in a grade at school while all your friends are going up a grade level. It is just frustrating and I wanted to improve quickly to catch up. I am convinced that I wasn't improving my game because, again, I did not take the time or effort to build my knowledge appropriately by memorizing those techniques of doing traditionally what's required to do so since the beginning. People always say just do the process and to trust the process. But if you are too lazy to do the overall process of what it takes, then that's pretty much on you. No advice will help if no action is taken seriously. So in a way, I always ask myself, how can I get out of this whitebelt tutorial phase if I don't break this lazy habit of mine and do what's required of putting more effort and time to my training? Again, like playing a video game, the frustration I felt of being stuck in a level for years that was not even a level, but a tutorial stage. Tell me, if you just brought a brand new video game, do you really want to get stuck playing the tutorial forever? Or do you just want to quickly finish that tutorial and finally get to the meat of playing the actual game? You know, to feel like you are actually leveling up and finally having fun. I really wanted to start actually tapping people and feel like I know what I am doing when rolling. After looking back at the years of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, of still being stuck in the skills of a newbie while still getting tapped all the time by everybody and by even new white belts that just signed up, and being in a state of having no sense of control in progressing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, a term that I like to call this is the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu tutorial hellhole. A hellhole of feeling like you are stuck and aren't able to do what's required to get to the next phase, can't memorize what's being taught to you, always making the same mistake over and over again, just not able to get out of the white belt tutorial phase after years of neglect. It pretty much sucked to be in that state. And during my break of 8 months from Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I tried thinking, if I ever come back to train again, what should I do or what can I do to make learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu easier to do without working as hard? What key aspect that I needed to focus working on that could drastically make a difference in my learning with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for the long run? I thought about it and eventually came to a conclusion of what is the key ability that I believe at the time that could help me get out of the state of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu tutorial hellhole and finally make some real progress in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu that if I had would generally make life easier. I came into a conclusion that the ability to have strong memorization skills is the key that could greatly solve most of my problems. Cause to learn anything in life, whether it's a lesson or to obtain a new skill, memorization is a required tool, and the better of one's ability to memorize, the easier process it is to overall learn. From that, an idea that I believe I wouldn't need to work as hard if I just had great memorization skills. I already know that I naturally don't have great memory when it came to learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques, but maybe if there is some method out there that could help me memorize Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques better without needing to work as hard, if there is such a method, then I needed to find it. Overall, the only way to escape the tutorial hellhole is to be able to first memorize and learn those fundamentals and basics in order to properly build a foundation. So at the time, during my break from Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu of 8 months, I did try to go look for a solution. There must be different ways to memorize Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques easier that doesn't require too much effort to do. Of course, eventually, after trying to go look for one anywhere I can, I soon realized there was really none that I could find to satisfy what I was looking for. They all mostly pointed to one solution. To try to get out of this white belt tutorial hellhole that I was in, there were no other solutions that I could really find at the time to help me fix my problems with memorizing techniques and make my lazy training work out. Literally looked everywhere for alternative advice from anyone out there who must have some sort of secret jiu-jitsu method to help memorize techniques without needing to drill or show up as much. 101 dummy guide to memorize Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques easy? I refuse to believe that drilling and showing up almost every day would be the only answer. Anything sounded pretty dumb and stupid for me to go look for that kind of solution, but man, I am lazy, and if there is an easier solution out there that could fit my needs, I would would take it. If someone out there had already invented the technology that was capable of helping us download martial arts into our brains quickly, like in the movie called The Matrix, then forget about doing the traditional way of working hard for years to be a master when you can just download it all in a couple of seconds and start kicking asses right away. I am the type of person to choose that option any day. But in the end of that time, there was nothing I could find but to follow the most logical solution that was staring right in front of me. That the best thing is to do for now is to put effort and do exactly what my coach and other people told me to do, which I eventually finally started to do in that year of signing back up to my gym, of giving Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu another shot. After an 8-month break, for a lazy bum like myself, I finally tried putting effort. I tried showing up to class as much as I can, even though I prefer being at home playing video games in my bed. I started scheduling and meeting up drilling with partners, even though I was pretty socially awkward and introverted. That time, as I was pushing forward in finally being serious in my training, I have to admit, over time I was finally steadily making some progress. It was slow, annoying, and even though I hated the process of the work I had to put in the whole time, I was finally starting to see some results I can be proud of. A glimmer of hope that kept getting bigger the more I put and bear the effort, that kept motivating me to push through to progress. Even though everything was going well for like 2 months, I had a good momentum going on since I started to stop lazy train and finally serious train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu until the pandemic hit. Gym closed down, can't really go out anywhere, and I basically had no one that I could train with. Though I was disappointed that I had to stop training, which pretty much sucked because I had a pretty good momentum going on of this serious training and trying to work hard for the first time in my life at something hard like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And now stuck at home for who knows how long, I thought I might forget everything I tried learning so far and start back to square one by the time the 2020 pandemic of COVID is over. Because with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I have to do something to maintain and grow what I know in order to progress. And since no gym, no partner to drill with, what can I do? What can I do when a thing like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu requires physical participation and practice in order to learn, build, and retain knowledge in the art? I kept trying to figure the best course of action in those trying times when everything was pretty chaotic. But eventually an idea came of what if I can try to figure out on my own to find a way to learn and memorize Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques without needing to be on the mats at my gym or a drilling partner. Since I couldn't find an answer to this problem from anywhere, I thought it could be a cool little project that I could try to figure out for myself. To start figuring out a way to start tackling this project of mine, my first thought was, in order to help get out of the whitebelt tutorial hellhole, I believe I just need to memorize and learn all of those fundamental and basic techniques first. Now again, I already understand there are many other factors I had to consider in order to actually learn them effectively, which mostly are from physical practice playing a big part in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. But since my options were limited at that time because of COVID lockdown, I thought I could at least just focus and work on the memorization aspect of learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, meaning the goal is to make my memorization possible in learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques without drilling or needing to show up anywhere. Again, I became fixated with memorization because I believe that if memorizing techniques and lessons is a way to build enough knowledge, then with that knowledge, it opens a gateway to further and deeper learning that then could lead to finally start building skills in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu with practice. So going back to the time of the start of the pandemic, I was trying to figure out something I could do to learn Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu that by the time the pandemic is over, that I'll be more prepared to go back to train at my gym again. The goal I decided to pursue was to at least be able to memorize all the fundamentals and basic techniques of my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu school, or at least a good amount, so that I may have enough knowledge to be ready and used to finally make progress when I come back to my gym to train again. But is trying to memorize all those fundamentals and basic techniques possible without a gym or drilling? Well, with no choice at the time, and because so far I couldn't find no other solution till that point but to say fuck it. let's try to figure it out. If I am going to be forced to stop my hard work training the traditional way of taking the rite of passage, then I might as well put that energy into working hard to create an alternative way to train in the meanwhile. So during the pandemic of COVID, my mind was set on creating an alternative way to deal with memorizing all those damn Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques.
Technique.
Because there are just so many of them. Like, bro, how do I remember them? Because what makes it hard is that the majority of consensus from practitioners is that in order for a way to memorize techniques, the traditional way is that you have to take enough time to physically drill and go over with them with a partner or teacher almost every day at a gym while taking classes. The overall experience that I hear from other people throughout the years who are trying to memorize and learn Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques for the first time is like trying to drink water from a fire hose. To get used to it, gotta do it every day until you are used to it by drilling and showing up. But if you are like me, usually the only type to show up to train and learn Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu mostly twice a week, then probably never going to get used to it. So is it really possible to memorize techniques without using drilling or showing up as a way to drink through the fire hose? Or is there an easier way that I can do it to make it not feel like drinking out of a fire hose in the first place? But before I can work on this aspect, I first had to figure out a way to make memorizing them without drilling or needing to show up to anywhere possible first. So as I started and kept doing more research and testing out different types of learning methods that I mostly found online, of trying to adapt them into making memorizing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu possible without a gym or the need to drill. Well, over time, as I kept looking for more methods and more ways to apply those methods to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, eventually narrowing, combining, and getting to a solution that I feel fit in finding a way without drilling or needing to show up to anywhere, I then finally started turning my focus onto that aspect to work on. When it came to the memorization for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, of trying to handle the memorization load intake of all that seemingly large amount of complex grappling information just being thrown at you, how can I make it better? Going back to the analogy of learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu feels like drinking out of a fire hose, instead of trying to drink out of the fire hose, the next phase was, how can I make it easier for myself by connecting that fire hose to something like a water fountain and make it into a steady stream for easier consumption to drink from whenever I am thirsty and make it more enjoyable process to do. The thought of not only finding a way to make Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu possible to memorize techniques without drilling and showing up, but also trying to make it more drastically easier to memorize as well in any way I can. That became the next focus that I really wanted to hone down on, of having a method that could also help make my memorization ability good enough to a point where I don't ever have to worry about forgetting techniques or stressing out trying to learn them, and could memorize them faster and easier. If I can figure it out by the time I am finally allowed to come back to train at my gym again, I thought, how much of an impact would it have and its potential towards my overall training? When reading and watching videos on the nature of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, of why it is difficult and why the retention of new people signing up and quitting after is so high, I believe that is because there's so much information being thrown at you that you have to consider in putting a lot of time and effort in order to learn it. For most people, if you are someone who has many factors going on in their life, such as life responsibilities and other interests to pursue, unless you are really good at time management and have a lot of control in your life, which I don't think most people are like that, are you willing to make sacrifices in order to put more time and effort in learning all that knowledge for this one thing that could take years to get somewhere in? If you are a dedicated gym bro who works out every day to get stronger but is starting to get into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, are you willing to sacrifice some of your workout sessions to make more time to train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu? If you are busy with work and have a family to support, do you have any more time and energy left in your day to give to train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. If you are lazy like me, who have low willpower and is easily distracted in doing other things, can you finally be dedicated in doing what's required to train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu? I overall think for most people who just started will find it difficult to try to fit training Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu into their already busy and chaotic lives. With that, I also believe for most people who try to start Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, they all probably have a similar experience to what I experienced. The experience that I felt is that no one is really there in the beginning to hold your hand in trying to figure or structure your life in making Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu work for you. You have to figure that out and find a way to make it work yourself if you want to get anywhere with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And throughout the years before the pandemic, since I first started doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I really wanted to find a way to make learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu work for a lazy person like myself. For me, it was difficult to approach trying to take the rite of passage of trying to show up and drill almost every day in order to build my foundation. For a while, I just felt like I wasn't willing to make the necessary sacrifices that it would take to build my foundation, because it seemed too hard and too much of a commitment for a lazy guy like me. The reasons why I took the rite of passage of training for like 2 months before the pandemic put a stop to it was that I finally reached to a point where I had enough getting beaten up all the time on the mats. I wanted to finally progress and start actually having fun with the sport and see it as something that I would do for a very long time. Looking back and giving my opinions to the time of me finally taking the rite of passage, showing up as much as I can was not bad. I did make the necessary sacrifices from taking away time and focus from a few of my other hobbies, such as gaming, lifting weights, also gave up trying to breakdance. I did this so that I could have more time and focus to train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It was a bit hard to start letting go and change the usual habit that I had. But yeah, that's how much I was willing to invest into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu at the time. I was very serious to finally progress. The only thing that I had a problem was drilling. I hated drilling, but for the sake of memorizing and learning techniques, that time, it was the only method that I could find as the only option that I could do. Normally, I would avoid it like I would avoid doing leg day, but I was desperate enough to finally start doing it consistently. Not knocking on or saying anything bad about the traditional way of doing things. When it comes to learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, again, I say it is the best solution to do for someone who is dedicated and committed enough to make it work. If people find that memorizing and learning techniques by just only drilling things out works best for them, then that is great. You should do what works best for you. But for me, in my opinion of drilling, I just felt like the overall way of trying to memorize a technique by physically drilling it over many times until it sticks to my brain, I just for some reason think it's a headache, time consuming, and a mentally exhausting process of doing it that way, especially for myself who just has a hard time with it every time I do it. It's so tedious and boring to do in order to memorize Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques. How I felt back then, it just doesn't give that instant gratification after I finish doing a session of it, like it does with working out. Just overall feels like a chore that I have to go through, and I honestly rather not. Don't get me wrong, I see that there are many other benefits to drilling and different variations of it, but deep down I feel like trying to use drilling as a way to memorize techniques doesn't give me enough stimulation to actually make things stick to my head. Like I am just throwing things in there and hoping at least 15% of what I tried shoving to my head for an hour would actually stay long enough to be useful later on. Overall, I just felt like I needed something more or different that could work better for me. And that's really how I always felt ever since I first started doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I did try to go look for an alternative way to learn Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques when I was in my 8th month break before the pandemic happened, and ended up finding no other satisfying solutions to make things easier. But if I can take this opportunity during the pandemic to spend my time to possibly create my own alternative way that could make my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu training more flexible, easier, and overall doesn't involve me needing to drill or show up to my gym as much in order to build my foundation, I saw it in the long run. If I can have those 3 things met, then I believed at that time I would succeed in making learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu work for me, who dreams to still make my lazy training of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu work and get results by the time the pandemic of COVID is finally over. Overall, I began to love an idea of making things easier and convenient to do or learn. Cause if I can figure out more ways to accomplish obtaining a skill or goal without sacrificing too much time, energy, and effort, then I can have more time, energy, and effort to potentially discover or enjoy other new things. To me, life is short. So why not try to figure out ways to make things easier, faster, and more efficient for myself so that I can live life to the fullest for the things that I want to enjoy doing the most, either for the short or long run. Every year, there is always people inventing and creating new ways to make hard things to do easier and more efficient, that more work can get done quickly, progress can grow more efficiently, and more time can be freed up to do other things. So you see my point? Why not try to do the same to help learn Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu so that me or possibly even more people could have a higher chance of success to enjoy doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu? Anyways, in order to have those 3 things I want in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu met, that is why I repeatedly came to a strong conclusion that obtaining better memorization skills would be the answer to achieve it, and over time was very determined in putting all my efforts into leveling up my memorizing capabilities. I saw it as the only solution that could make my life easier in learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. If I could look for an alternative way to memorize techniques without needing to drill or requiring to always be at the gym, as well as making memorizing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques easier for a person like myself to understand, then I feel potentially that by the time the pandemic is over, taking that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu rite of passage would be easier to do, or that I wouldn't need to do it that way at all. Again, in general sense, to me, having strong memory skills, I believe would make my whole life easier. I mean, how many of us wish that we were born with something like photographic memory that we could use to our advantage during our school days? I know that it is debatable if photographic memory is really a thing or not because of how movies and pop culture portrayed it as. I'm not gonna get into all that, but man, during my school days, why bother studying all week, stressing out trying to memorize things for the test? If you have photographic memory, just study 5 minutes before the test and you still get full marks. In a way, I wish I was born with the ability of having naturally strong memory, but since I am not born with having a strong memory, the next best thing is to figure out a method that could make my memory strong, a different way of thinking and processing information that I could do to make memorizing and learning things easier for anything that I may get interested in learning for. When it comes to having strong memorization skills, especially in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, from me interpreting the words of professionals and experts in the learning field and trying to relate it to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I would say that it can deeply enhance the learning and application of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu by facilitating quicker learning, more effective application of techniques, and greater adaptability and confidence in the sport. But to put it another way, in my own terms, I see having strong memorization skills means that I don't have to drill as much in order to effectively learn a technique. I don't have to show up to class in order to review as much. And if I can memorize everything I learn from my classes or from instructor easier, then less stress overall. The desire to not work as hard when I finally come back to train at my gym again was very strong in me. And I fully believed that having strong memorization skills would help get me there. That was my goal. So after almost a year of experimenting, trying to keep figuring it out, constantly researching memory techniques that I already knew or learned during the pandemic, and then trying to apply them to learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, combining, adapting, and refining them to make memorizing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques much easier and more effective for myself. With all the time I spent, I finally came up with a solution that practically did make Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques more easier to memorize and overall convenient to do for a lazy me. That as a result, after the strict pandemic lockdown was finally somewhat over and I was finally able to come back to my gym to test things out using my method, since then I found myself having more an effective training since memorizing techniques was not much of an issue anymore. My rolls became more better and funner as I was able to focus on applying the techniques and learn from my rolls instead of always spasming around like an idiot, feeling clueless to what I was just doing in my rolls and wasting pointless energy for no reason. With this method that I have created, it accomplished in fulfilling my desire to continue my lazy training habit in a way that I can still improve my learning in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu without needing to show up as much to my gym or drill as much, as well as helping me finally getting out of the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu white belt tutorial phase. Well, I am still technically a white belt of the time of this recording, but I am happy to say my skills are out of the white belt tutorial phase. But overall, the experience of being able to memorize a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu technique quickly and strongly enough to my long-term memory so I don't have to worry about forgetting it, and I can just jump straight into trying to work on it and use it when I roll with somebody, and finally just have fun in experimenting and enjoy Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu without feeling like it's a constant struggle. This finally became the more ideal way of how I wanted to actually approach learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, cause in the grand scheme in everyday life, I don't know about you guys, but after a long day of work or whatever drama in my life, showing up to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu class, I don't want to be stressed out even more being frustrated in trying to learn Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques that I will worry about forgetting easily right after. I want to be able to memorize and have it quickly in my arsenal like a new toy and just jump straight into rolling right after. Because at the end of a long day, I want to do things that I look forward to, and I want to feel rewarded after doing them. Rolling and learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu has now truly become what I look forward to whenever I show up to my gym. It is my escape and stress reliever. It has become pretty life-changing now because memory and being lazy has always been the issue that kept me back from learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Back then, I always felt like if I ever attend class or even private lessons or seminars that cost additional moolah, I always say, what's the point of doing that? If I am overall still not consistent or putting enough effort with my training to make it work of being able to retain and follow up with what I just learned from them, and basically just going to forget all that knowledge right after, what was the point to begin with? But now, since memorizing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques has now become no more of an issue, and so far because of that, I eventually got to a level in my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu where I know enough to branch from and can retain new knowledge much easier whenever I have time. Showing up to my classes or even taking those expensive privates and seminars have become more worth it now that after I take them, whatever new knowledge or advice I am shown from them doesn't feel like it's gonna slip away from my head that easy. Like, I feel like I actually get to keep what I paid for. To sum this up, the saying I used to have was, what's the point in acquiring knowledge if you're just going to forget it right after? I wanted to fix this problem, but didn't want to do of what was required at the time of taking the rite of passage. When I first started Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, again, too lazy. So I went to create an alternative way that would satisfy my laziness and improve my ability to memorize techniques. I wanted to get my cake and eat it too, kind of thought. And I think I succeeded in doing so. Just in case, for anyone watching, don't misunderstand. I wasn't trying to make a method that would be an easy solution to get me to black belt level or make me the best grappler or be #1 all-time GOAT in the sport. My overall goal when I was making this method was that I just want to make my training easier and more convenient, that it would be effective and flexible enough to do to help me memorize techniques, and that it would lead to having an easier time to finally build my foundation, but not work as hard. Call it a lazy dream of mine. Overall, since I first started Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu until now, my mindset was that I only see myself mostly a hobbyist or casual player, not a serious or dedicated one. I do love to train Jiu-Jitsu Jiu-Jitsu, but at most times, I am just not serious with it. And because back then, since I wasn't serious or dedicated enough to it at the beginning of starting out, that was really the main problem that held me back from making any progress of getting out of the white belt phase for years. If I was hardcore and dedicated like some of the people at my gym, of showing up every day, train and drill for hours, and constantly eat and sleep Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, then I would probably have gotten out of the white belt phase much earlier, probably have amazing results, and be pretty high level in my grappling right about now. But I am not that type of person. I just want to approach learning and doing things at my own pace and comfort, and I just want to get good at something enough to just have fun. Till now, these days, I only be on the mats 1 to maybe 3 times a week because I got other things going on in my life that makes it difficult for me to be fully committed and train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu every day. For me, I have many types of other interests on my plate that Jiu-Jitsu is just a part of, that I just want to enjoy it whenever I feel like it. Of course, after getting out of the white belt phase, I still do want to get even better at Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in the future, but I know I can't pursue at getting more better with something like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu without sacrificing more time, effort, and commitment. That will be up to me when I decide to push forward. But for now, with this method of mine, I feel like it all worked out for me in a way to help get satisfyingly good enough with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu that fits my lifestyle and pace. So far, I feel like I made it to a good stage to where I feel like I have a sense of control in my progression with this art. For the longest time, I worry about investing my time to things that could be depreciating. Seeing now that I am 27 years old and knowing that life just gets busier as I get older and more responsibilities somehow keeps piling on over time. So whenever, if I can make my time that I do spend with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, then I want it to feel like it's worth my time doing instead of feeling like a chore or a waste of time. So anyways, with that all out of the way before it gets too much of an epiphany and life stuff, I know that I must be rambling on and on about the same things over many times with my perspectives and motivations that led me to create this method. With further ado, let me introduce you to how I memorize Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu technique. This is a method that I created for myself to help memorize Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques without needing to show up to a gym or drilling as much. I call it the I am too lazy to show up to my gym or drill today, so I'll do this instead method. Too long of a name, so I will call it the lazy method instead. A method that really helped during the pandemic and after, in making up for rarely showing up to train at my gym or drill. It was my shortcut to get out of the white belt phase and avoid doing traditionally of what's required in order to do so, of being a great alternative to do, of helping me memorize techniques without much stress while relaxing on my couch. Looking back, after spending about almost a year of taking and combining different learning methods and ideas from different sources, putting them all together to make the one best method for me to help with memorizing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques. As a result, when I applied it to my lazy training of using it and still kept on trying to refine it more in any way I can for the past couple of years, I found a lot of improvements in my game. People that know me and I occasionally roll with at the gym, a lot of them were genuinely surprised and impressed at how fast I was learning, that I was not struggling with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu like I used to before. It really is a unique way that I have developed for the only goal of trying to make learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu much easier for a lazy bum like myself who rarely shows up or drill. Looking back, after somewhat on and off of 3 years of struggling with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, when I first started from 2017 to 2020 of being stuck in the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu tutorial hellhole, then the pandemic happened. After that, these next past 4 years from 2020 to 2024 have been pretty fun and rewarding since making and using this method of mine. I mostly consider the lazy method to be like training wheels that got me to where I am, and so far it is what I rely on when I have trouble learning learning any new or complicated techniques that I come across to memorize them faster and easier. Overall, I think it's a method that over the times that I have spent on experimenting and refining it, I think it is to a point where it's completed enough to finally talk about and share. Just letting you all know, if you haven't noticed yet, most of what I have and about to present and introduce of what I have learned for my research in trying to make this lazy method are all on a trust me bro basis. Oh, by the way, if you skip to the video to this point, I will be mentioning a lot about these two terms called the white belt tutorial phase and the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu rite of passage that I talked about more descriptively in the beginning parts of this video. So if you don't know these terms yet, just in case for better clarification going forward from here, skip back to this part of the video to know them. So my apologies, everything in this video all in a way ties together. So if you want more of the full picture, watch the video from beginning to the end. But again, if you just want to get to the point of the mechanics of how my method works, continue watching from here. There is a saying that thoughts lead to action, and my thoughts have been, what is the laziest way that I could train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which led me to create this method of mine. This method of mine consists of 6 elements that I found very impactful and practical in my research into making Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu easier to memorize and learn for myself. They are time and convenience, source, chunking method and pattern method, visualization and active recall method, space repetition and data, physical application and refinement. Let's start off with time and convenience. Like I said earlier, in order to memorize Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques that could lead to helping me build my foundation, I realized that taking the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu rite of passage of showing up and drilling almost every day is not always a practical thing for me to do in order to just memorize techniques. Showing up to my gym and drilling works hand in hand in a way that they both pretty much require me to do it every day in order to be effective as a way to memorize techniques. And I just think that's not always a thing that I could do unless I am super committed and dedicated to make it work. I got other things to do, other interests to pursue, and a regular 9 to 5. So having the motivation or time to constantly figure out ways to consistently train like that almost every day as much as I can work is gonna be a challenge for me, a lazy guy. To me, nothing will always go smoothly in life. There will always be some sort of level of friction that always makes it more difficult to achieve doing something. Whether that friction is a requirement or resistance, big or small, it will be the bumps and cracks on the road to make your journey to reach a goal either uncomfortable to unachievable. This is what's called having friction in life. Friction in life refers to the various obstacles, challenges, and difficulties that can slow down or complicate one's progress, goals, or everyday activities. This concept can encompass physical, emotional, psychological, or situational barriers that make tasks harder to accomplish. I give you an example of friction in life. To me, friction in life is making a bowl of cereal and finding out after that you already ran out of milk. Friction in life is you go to a public bathroom stall, do your business, and find out later you don't have any toilet paper in there. Or worse, someone who used that bathroom stall before you replaced it with sandpaper. Friction in life is when you need to make an important call or message but your phone dies. Friction in life is when you want to go to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu training but your significant other demands you guys spend time together that day. Friction in life is the long car drive that you have to do to get to somewhere, And I would argue that driving a car to somewhere has become a more difficult friction in life. In everyday modern life, ever since ordering and doing things online have become more popular each day, why go anywhere and risk anything like getting stuck in traffic when you can just get it done online in the comfort of your own home? The reasons why I think online shopping, remote work, and food delivery services like Uber Eats, of why more and more people are drawn to prefer those things than traditionally just go out and do it themselves, to go to shopping places, to their physical work location, and to head to the actual restaurant to eat or pick up food themselves, is because it's more convenient and easier to do it that way. And the question is, can learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu be in a way the same? That it can be very convenient, that you don't need to show up to anywhere to train or required to drill with a partner as much in order to get things to progress, to at least just help with memorizing techniques? Can there be a different solution that could make the process more convenient and less stressful to do? Whenever I used to get out of work or deciding to head down to my gym from my home, what always triggers my lazy brain and stops me from doing that at times is the driving that I needed to do to get to my gym. It used to be not bad before because I used to only live about 5 minutes drive away from my gym, but now that I live over 30 minutes away, it has gotten worse. I know to some of you out there, 30 minutes drive is no big deal, but to me, it's my own mental obstacle that is annoyingly something I have to overcome each time I start deciding to head down to my gym to train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. The little tiny voice always pops up in my head as I am heading to my car of telling me, do I really need to train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu today? It's going to be a long drive. And from there, the tiny voice starts to get louder. My lazy subconsciousness starts to influence me more and more to tell me I can just do this tomorrow instead. Why bother the hassle? I have all the time in the world to train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu later, coming up with many types of excuses and arguments and reasons that I should not show up today or do what's required to train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu properly. Why go to a place filled with sweaty people in Japanese pajamas that you have to get into uncomfortable close contact with and get your ass beaten up by?
Nah, I don't really feel like it.
When you could just comfortably stay home, order some of your favorite foods, and play video games. That thought eventually becomes so convincing enough that I just end up staying home and not train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Looking back at the experience of training Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as used to being a struggling, lazy white belt grappler, if I want to take the rite of passage of training Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu effectively, I had to be careful, because the more days or times that I don't show up to the gym to train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu by drilling or going over techniques, the more I am risking delaying my progress to get out of the white belt tutorial phase, which I feel like having that constant pressure to keep up with training appropriately enough is a mental friction in itself. So whenever that happens, what can I at least do to help progress Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu where I don't have to feel stressed out or worried about my progress being hindered or delayed because I decided to succumb to my decision to just stay home for who knows how many days or weeks of slacking off from my training? In Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, friction in the sport can refer to the various challenges and obstacles practitioners face both on and off the mats. These frictions can hinder progress, create difficulties, or test one's perseverance. When it comes to learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, besides having the actual hassle that it can be to make time or the journey to just get to a place where it is the perfect environment to train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I say having memorization problems can be the real major friction that can really hold you back from making progress in learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu effectively. But as we will continue on in this video, I will eventually show you more of the parts to my solution that I came up with that helps fix that problem. But anyways, with this method of mine, even though if I can't or don't want to show up to the gym or be able to drill anywhere and anytime I want, I can at least work on memorizing techniques anywhere and anytime anytime I want with my method. When first creating this method of mine, I had to consider a psychological aspect about myself. I am the type of human that is intrinsically the lazy type. I always want to find paths to take that offer the least resistance to accomplish something. So I thought, if I'm going to make a method to memorize Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques, I have to make sure that it is something that could be available to do anytime and anywhere without much requirements, resistance, and overall as little friction as possible. From that, I concluded that the first thing I should focus on figuring out that is the most important step in the right direction if I want to save some hassle and make life easier to learn Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu effectively in the future. The answer is to find a way to make memorizing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques a more convenient thing to do. Overall, without the aspect of conveniency being included in my method, the other aspects of my method effectiveness would not be as strong and not work well enough in the long run for a lazy me to handle. The power of convenience. In behavioral science, it suggests that people are not in a way inherently lazy, but that our brains are naturally wired to value convenient options. In a way, what this means is that if you want to make a behavior happen more often, make it easy. The more convenient it is for a behavior to occur, the more likely it is that the behavior will occur. You know what, guys? I don't think I am lazy at all. I say that my brain is more wired to favor convenient options. But anyways, the idea to make memorizing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques as convenient, easy to do, and frictionless as much as possible that even a lazy person like me can't make any excuses for not doing it. If I want a behavior to happen of me actually using this method of mine and being consistent with it and actually putting it to practice, after I have finally finished creating it, then I have to make it a convenient thing to do as much as possible. That is the first piece of the puzzle that I believe could help me in the long run before I could focus on working on the next piece of improving my ability to memorize effectively easier, which is crucial because how do you expect to learn when you can't memorize shit? The easier you can memorize something, the better. But before I can focus on that aspect of my method, I first have to make it a priority to figure out a way to make it very convenient to memorize and review techniques anytime and anywhere work with no gym or drilling required. So how? Well, here is a solution that I have found to make things convenient. For starters, this method of mine is done on my smartphone on a memory app called Anki, which is a digital flashcard app with a powerful review system method, helping you memorize things like language vocabulary, medical terms, you name it. I used to carry physical paper flashcards that I made with me everywhere, but over time I just find it to be not practical or convenient enough to do it that way the more techniques I memorize, which results in the more paper cards I had to carry with me over time. It's a hassle. Overall, since I view Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques to be like vocabulary words, I was thinking, how can I apply this app in helping me memorize them more conveniently and efficiently? Well, after applying this app to my method, I found the results to be amazing, but more on this app on how powerful it is that I will discuss later in the video because it has its own segment in the video. For now, I just want to focus on explaining what makes the lazy method very convenient and frictionless side of things first, before I get into more other details and aspects to my method. But yes, this method of mine heavily requires in using this memory app, which is available on any smartphone and computers that can be synced all together by by the Anki cloud so that I can keep switching to different devices and still make progress from where I left off, making actually using the method convenient and versatile. This is perfect for me because I am always on my tech anywhere I go, and whenever I feel like it, I can just pull out the app with my smartphone, study a technique I want to learn, review, and start working on memorizing it. Then, when I am done with using my method to memorize the technique, I close the app, having confidence that I have added another technique to my knowledge. I just put my tech away in my pocket and move on to do whatever I was doing. Easy and frictionless. No need to show up to anywhere or drilling involved in order to just memorize techniques. I always have my smartphone with me everywhere I go. I see almost everyone around me have theirs on them as well. I bet you, the viewer, are also on your smartphone right now watching this video. You have to admit it. This is the world we live in, and you can't go a day without your phone. For me, I could be distracted by it, which I mostly am, going on a YouTube and social media binge, or I could be productive with it, like using it to help me learn and memorize Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques. There are times when I am out and about doing things like traveling or hanging out with my family and friends, taking a dump in the bathroom, and waiting in line at the grocery store, or just in bed, not wanting to go train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu at my gym at times. I can at least be able to memorize and maintain my knowledge on Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques in some way at my house or on the go. Using this app with my method was game-changing, but overall, this app is amazing. Love using it all the time, makes memorizing a convenient and frictionless experience. I am not sponsored by them or anything, which I wish I was. The app is free on computers and on non-Apple smartphones, so check it out. I believe there can always be convenient versions or ways to approach doing things. I give you an example, which is more convenient form of exercise. If you have to choose, primarily do one or the other, lifting weights or calisthenics. From my experience of trying out both before, and from that, I say calisthenics would be the more convenient form of exercise to do, because you can do calisthenics almost anywhere and it doesn't require much in order to do. Probably all you need is the ground to do your workouts on, while compared to lifting weights, it is the least convenient because it will require you to always needing to go to a place that has lifting equipment and weights in order for you to do your workouts. You can do push-ups and pull-ups more conveniently anywhere, but you can't do a bench press or deadlifts conveniently anywhere. Now, like I mentioned before, when it comes to memorizing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques as a brand new grappler, there is the traditional way of doing it, which requires you to be more self-disciplined to do what's required, to put in more effort and commitment in order for it to work, which is taking the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu rite of passage is all about, of showing up as much as you can to your gym, as well as making time to constantly drill techniques and going over them with somebody. But this means that you are almost always required to go to a place that has the perfect environment for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and constantly have to find a partner that is available to train with. Always have to work around your own life schedule to make it work, all in order to effectively keep up with your learning until you finally reach to a certain point of finally building your foundation, which again is not a convenient thing that I find myself to be committed and determined enough to be able to approach it that way as a lazy beginner grappler who lacks self-discipline. So what would be the most convenient alternative way that I can at least do anywhere and anytime without much requirements or friction at my own pace to help just at least memorize techniques for now and later try to build the skills on how to properly perform them whenever I have time to show up to the gym to train? Well, that would be my method and why I created it for. Source. The sources or materials that I use my method on to memorize Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques from. This method of mine is best suited for mostly only memorizing and analyzing from Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques in video format. My method relies not just focusing in memorizing techniques but the full video tutorials that they are associated with. Here is an example. Say if I want to learn how to do a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu technique called the Kimura, I would type and search it on YouTube, then pick a tutorial that I like or catches my eye and try to memorize everything in that tutorial using my method. From start to finish, I will most likely accomplish in memorizing and analyzing almost everything in that tutorial about knowing how to do the Kimura the best and the most optimal way I can, which sounds a bit crazy that I am in a weird way saying that I am memorizing the whole Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu tutorial. Not exactly, because using my method is more of a way for me to extract and memorize as much information as I can get from it, but not like memorize it word for word of having the whole video file downloaded to my brain. That would be crazy talk. All I am saying is that my method makes it more effective to memorize from these Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu video tutorials that is in a way organized and efficient for me to understand better. That after using my method, even after a week without review, I can feel confident in my ability to recall as much information as I can from almost any Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu tutorial I come across and learn from. Little confusing, but I will try to make it more clearer later on in the video. But you may ask, why video format? Why can't the method be used to memorize techniques during class or other situations that involves in person? Well, first off, my method is only formulated to memorize Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques from video tutorials. And second, since we live in a time where we have the internet that has endless video tutorials and information of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques being posted every minute, especially on YouTube, I felt that it would be easier to watch and learn from them because they are always available anywhere you go as long as you are connected to the internet. Also, when it comes to comparing the stress of dealing with the flow of information being presented from in-person class to learning from the internet, back then, from the perspectives of a new beginner grappler, I felt that anytime I attend the classes, usually a class would last for about an hour at my gym. During that hour, I would be presented with about 3 to 4 techniques within that time. Doesn't seem like a lot to cover, but man, there is just so many details and steps to them that during class, it just feels too fast of a pace and overall an overwhelming time to keep up with what's being taught. Like, information is just being thrown at me to where I'd be stressing out, trying to retain everything I can at that moment as it's being taught. But compared to when it comes to learning from a video tutorial, I have more options to pause, rewind, and overall the flow of information being presented and reviewed can be controlled at my own pace. Less to no rush of trying to keep up with what's being taught or feeling bad about being slow to understand or overloaded as much to retain and memorize new information. So to memorize and learn from video tutorials is what I find to be more practical and convenient for me to have sources that I can always rely on as a way to review techniques and build a theoretical understanding of them in my own time, wherever and whenever I want. We have the power of seemingly unlimited information that we can have access to in the palm of our hands. If we compare to back then when the internet didn't exist, where did people used to mainly go go in order to learn new information? Well, that would be from either school or the library. But nowadays, you don't have to go anywhere. You can just look it up on the internet at home. With that, I don't have to always show up in person to my gym as the only way to seek for those knowledge of even for the most basics of information, or constantly bother the coach or higher belts as much on unnecessary things like getting them to teach me many of the same techniques that I kept on forgetting and having trouble with for the 100th time anymore. I always feel bad whenever I do that back when I was a beginner, cause for me, if I can't remember the many advice or lessons that my coach or other higher belts give me and end up forgetting even the most basic information later on anyways, I feel like I am wasting my time and everyone else's time, and I just don't want to become a nuisance of always asking the same thing over and over again in person. But with the internet, I can always just do a quick Google search as many times as I want, asking or looking for the same questions and advice that I may keep forgetting thousands of times without feeling like a bother to anyone. I learned nowadays that before asking for help or advice at my gym, I feel like I can just cover a lot of what I am looking for if I just do a quick YouTube or Google search, do my own self-study, narrow down to the specifics that caters towards my needs at any given time. Then, if I ever get stuck or confused and need help, I can tailor the more complicated and finer details of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu questions that can't easily be effectively answered in the online space. Save them for the time that whenever I do show up to train at my gym, I could ask my coach or other higher belts to help me understand better, or even expand that specific topic in further to more detail. I feel that way of doing things to be more efficient with my time and theirs. Example, say you pay a master chef couple of hundreds of dollars for a private lesson. During that private lesson, do you really want to ask a master chef on how to boil an egg? Probably not, because why bother asking things that are too simple and basic that could mostly be easily answered in the internet for free? Don't waste your time and the master chef's time asking that. But if it comes to wanting to cook more of a special, complicated dish that requires attention to fine detail and skill, then yeah, it will probably be more worth your time asking a master chef for help or advices. In a way, I don't have a personal coach available 24/7 to bother and ask for help anytime I want, or the funds to afford it. But what I do have is the internet, with limitless information and availability that are just a hand reached away. So glad that I am born in the era with supercomputers that could fit in my pocket. Overall, during the pandemic, the goal was to figure out a way to help in building my foundation. And in order to do so, I needed to have a reliable source of videos that can just teach me only the fundamentals and basics, and also be used as a source to start experimenting and developing a method with. Luckily for me, there was a reliable source that I could easily have access to, because the source of where I ended up memorizing and learning most of the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu fundamentals and basic techniques from, especially during and after the pandemic lockdown, using my lazy method. They are from my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu gym's website that has all of the fundamentals and basic techniques in video format, all made by my instructor. Thanks to Coach Jay for providing such a great website. I use the heck out of it and it benefited me greatly. chunking method and pattern method. As I mentioned earlier in the video, learning the grappling art like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu does not come quickly or naturally to most people. In order to be able to start understanding how to grapple in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, you need to first learn and memorize a good amount of techniques to add to your repertoire to then start using and work on in building your foundation. If you want to speak a language, you have to start off knowing a good amount of vocabulary words first. When it comes to memorizing and learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques, people will find it to be a challenge because of complexity. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques often involve multiple steps and intricate movements that need to be executed precisely in a somewhat step-by-step process. What techniques you need to start learning first are the fundamentals and basics, which at my gym are around 150. It can take years and can be very hard to start trying to know them all for the average beginner grappler, as well as trying to know the many variations of each technique, and understanding when and how to use them requires significant practice. So to start to try to understand and make sense of the complexity, I ask the question to anyone: is drilling a technique over and over for who knows how many times until the technique finally makes sense? Is it really the only way to effectively memorize a technique? When I was first starting out in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and was introduced to the drilling method, my first thoughts is that I saw the drilling method to be the same method or another form called rote learning, a method that I had previous experience using most of my life and eventually gave up trying to use as a way to memorize things. If you don't know what rote learning is, rote learning is a memorization technique based on repetition. The idea is that the more you repeat something, the more likely you are to remember it. This method emphasizes the memorization of information without necessarily understanding its meaning or context. Or in other words, just do something over and over again until you annoy your brain enough to finally memorize it. I am not really a big fan of rote learning, as you can tell. In my experience, after discovering and using many other better or more efficient learning and memory methods to make my study life for many different things to become drastically easier, I currently see rote learning to be a not very effective way to memorize things. To me, it doesn't get the job done smoothly and just a more stressful process to do it that way. Ever since when I first started doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and saw how much the drilling method was similar to rote learning, I think I just subconsciously wanted to avoid doing it that way. Most people, when they start out not knowing anything better in trying to learn something new, will likely default in using this rote learning as a way to memorize things, because it is a straightforward method that doesn't require complex understanding or analysis. It just involves repetition, which is simple to implement. Most of us probably were brought up one way or another, or in an educational system of having rote learning traditionally emphasized as mostly the only way to learn things, taught to us as a tried and true method. Back then, before I started doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and discovered my lazy method or any other learning methods, this was how I thought the process of memorization worked. That if I wanted to learn new information, I would have to constantly review it over and over again until it sticks to my memory. In scientific studies, it shows a fact that the human brain is a highly energy demanding organ. At rest, the brain uses about 20% of the body's total energy expenditure, despite only making up about 2% of the body's weight. So for your brain, it will never hold on to information that it does not think is important enough to hold on to, because it burns so much energy that it is a matter matter of life or death. The human brain does a lot to keep the human body running the best it can. The human brain purpose is mainly related for survival. So whatever information you give it better be worth enough to have the brain use more energy to make room for it. To make your brain deem an information worthy of having, you have to either be constantly exposed to that information or anything that is related to it enough until your brain decides it's worth keeping long term, or really make it easy for the brain to understand its value, that the brain can immediately ingrain it to memory right away. If the information is not deemed worth it for the brain, then the brain's natural ability to forget will kick in and get rid of it, because forgetting is a mechanism that protects the brain by managing cognitive load and energy use. So what are the ways or methods that we can do to make the information worthy enough for the brain to keep? And I ask, what is the most optimal and easy way or method to do it that works best for me? Is rote learning the only way? And the answer I found is no. Throughout my life, I honestly never really found success or value with rote learning for memorization. I tried many times, but rote learning just wasn't effective to use to memorize things long term. Nowadays, I currently see it to be an inferior and crude method that just wastes my time doing. And again, ever since I discovered other better ways to memorize things to get more done, since then, out of subconscious habit, I automatically wanted to avoid doing any method that is similar to rote learning, like drilling, for example. There are just those aspects of rote learning in the drilling method that I just don't like. And again, that is the idea of focusing and relying too much on repetition to keep doing something over and over again until it's memorized and makes sense, which doesn't seem to make sense for me anymore. Instead of focusing on repetition, I learned that I should focus more on the process. Here is how I look at the process when it comes to memorization. Process is truly what makes information worthy for the brain to keep. If the process of memorizing is bad, then you need more repetition to make up for it. If the process of information is good, then you don't need as much repetition. I think rote learning or drilling has really little to no process to be effective for memorization. So it just only relies in mainly using a lot of repetition to make up for it. So my plan was to basically improve the process in my own way that works best for me. And I believe that I succeeded in doing so. Now, before I can show you my process that I created to make memorization easier for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques, I have to first talk about something called short-term memory and long-term memory. If you don't know what short-term memory and long-term memory is, here is a quick rundown. Short-term memory and long-term memory are two fundamental types of memory that plays critical roles in our ability to understand, process, and recall information. Short-term memory. Short-term memory, also known as working memory, involves the temporary storage of information that is currently being processed or used. It's like a mental workspace where we hold information for brief periods, typically for about 20 to 30 seconds. Although this can be extended through techniques such as rehearsal, short-term memory is limited in capacity. It's often cited that adults can hold about 7 items of information at a time.
Bathroom code is 66482610355549.
Could you say that again?
This limitation can vary based on the nature of the information and individual differences. Short Short-term memory is crucial for daily activities such as holding a phone number in mind long enough to dial it, or remembering a sentence you've just read as you move on to the next. It plays a key role in cognitive tasks like problem solving, reasoning, and comprehension. Long-term memory. Long-term memory, on the other hand, refers to the storage of information over extended periods, potentially lasting from minutes to a lifetime. Unlike short-term memory, the capacity of long-term memory is believed to be virtually unlimited. It encompasses everything we know and can recall, including facts, experiences, skills, and the knowledge of how to perform tasks, also known as procedural memory. Information typically passes through short-term memory, also known as working memory, before it can be stored in long-term memory. Think of short-term memory as a kind of entryway or temporary storage where information is briefly held and processed. If the information is deemed important or is repeatedly used or rehearsed, it can then move into long-term memory, where it can be stored for much longer periods, from days to even a lifetime. This process allows us to filter and prioritize the vast amount of information we encounter daily, ensuring that only the most relevant or used information is kept for long-term use. There is this thing called cognitive load. Cognitive load refers to the amount of mental effort being used in the working memory, also known as short-term memory. It is a concept from cognitive psychology that describes the strain placed on the brain's cognitive resource when performing tasks. Or another way to describe it, cognitive load is a crucial concept in understanding how people process information and perform tasks. Managing cognitive load effectively can improve learning, problem solving, and overall cognitive performance. Now, what if information is too much for the short-term memory to handle? There is a term called cognitive overload that can occur when too much information is presented at once, exceeding the capacity of short-term memory. When more information is received than it can handle, some of it may not be effectively processed or transferred to long-term memory. This is because the cognitive system can become overwhelmed, leading to difficulties in focusing, processing, and encoding information for long-term storage. Because again, the short-term memory, aka working memory, has a limited capacity, often described as being able to hold about 2 to 7 items at once. So any information or task that has high cognitive load can quickly exceed this capacity, leading to decreased performance and learning. Definitely, the task of shoving knowledge and the complexity of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques into the short-term memory will exceed that capacity. When it comes to learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, you need Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu materials in your head to work with. The only problem is getting the materials inside your head first. Again, going to back then, from my experience of used to being a struggling white belt grappler, it used to be that whenever I am in my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu class, I always felt overwhelmed and overloaded at how much information is being thrown at me, that I just felt like it is just not going to stick in my head after class. And probably the next day or two, again, following the traditional way to learn Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, if I don't drill, don't attend the next class soon enough, and over overall just not being consistent with my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu training to go over, follow up, and review what I am learning, I am going to end up completely forgetting it all quickly. This experience was always truly a constant frustration for a lazy guy like me. But like I said before, how do you expect to learn if you can't memorize shit? Each Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques overall to me just contains so much information that it is always overwhelming. Back when I was a beginner, I feel like I was not really able to absorb what's being taught in class effectively at all, cause it just seems so large and forgettable information to fit in this tiny brain of mine to make it stay long enough to be useful. Almost 3 years of feeling this way, of having problems, of not being able to memorize the basics and fundamentals, cause for some reason it seems so complex and overwhelming for me to keep up in trying to understand them. It used to always feel like a stressful experience to learn new Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques, which constantly always bothered me. So at some point during the time of being in pandemic lockdown, eventually I came to focus more on the idea on how memorizing and learning information should be processed to make it strategically sync better to memorized, instead of always trying to do what I feel, trying to just constantly force it using the old usual stressful and harder way. That doesn't work for a lazy me. What I am getting at is to make the process better and less stressful, I really have to find a method that can help in dealing on this aspect of managing cognitive load. At that point, as I have already made progress in figuring out a convenient source of where I am going to memorize techniques from, of having control over the pace of how much information is being thrown at me, which I am again so glad that we live in the age of the internet and having a pause button that we could press and rewind for online Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu tutorials. But now the next real focus is to manage the cognitive load, aka how can I actually memorize all of those information of the complexities and variations that techniques can have in those Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu tutorials, cause just one Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu technique tutorial can still have so many parts, movements, nuances, and steps to it, where it's still going to feel like a chore and a hassle to take some time to memorize them all, and still can just overwhelm and overload this brain of mine. So the next piece of the puzzle, if I want to avoid overloading and overwhelming my mind when it comes to learning and memorizing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques, I have to figure out a way to make the process better so that my short-term memory is able to handle and overcome any Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu knowledge I throw at it, and is more willing to open the gates of long-term memory for those knowledge to enter more easily. I was looking for an information processing method that could be the answer, a way that makes memorizing as much information of every single parts, details, or steps of each and every different Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques out there, of looking them up and trying to learn them from online tutorials, go through my short-term memory to my long-term memory much easier, faster, and without feeling overloaded, that I can feel confident that whatever Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu information goes into my head will stay and not be easily forgettable. I always ask myself how funny my memory works sometimes. For example, why is it that every time I watch a certain movie for the first time, especially if it's a good one, that even after a week or even a month after watching it, I can still almost remember everything about it, the character's name, the plot, the faces. But anytime when it comes to meeting a person in real life for the first time, of them telling me their name, and after like the next 5 minutes, I already ended up completely forgetting their name. Embarrassing, but it just happens. Why is it that, say, a 2-hour movie can easily go into the long-term memory while a simple name has a hard time staying in the short-term memory? So in a way, I thought, interestingly, when comparing the two situations, how can can I recreate the same effect that has that level of memory potency that remembering a movie gives, that makes it so easily memorable and ingrained after seeing it for the first time once, that makes it hard to forget? Well, here is the answer. Eventually, I found, modified, and applied a learning processing method called chunking to be used to memorize Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques in my own way, that I found to be very potent and effective. Like, it gives me almost the same feeling of experiencing remembering a movie in terms of being able to recall information. But anyways, first, what is chunking? For all of you who don't know, chunking is a cognitive strategy that involves breaking down information into smaller, manageable units or chunks to make it easier to process and remember. This method is based on the way how our short-term memory works. It's generally limited to holding about 7 pieces of information at once, according to a well-known theory by psychologist George A. Miller. By organizing information into chunks, the cognitive load on short-term memory is reduced, making it easier to encode information into long-term memory for future retrieval. Benefits of chunking in learning. 1. Improved memory retention. By organizing information into chunks, learners can improve their ability to store and recall information. 2. Enhanced understanding. Chunking helps in understanding complex information by breaking it down into more digestible parts. Understanding the relationships between these parts within a larger whole can also deepen comprehension. 3. Increased focus. By focusing on smaller units of information at a time, learners can reduce cognitive overload, making it easier to concentrate and engage with the material. 4. Efficiency in learning. Chunking can make study sessions more productive by allowing learners to cover more material in less time, thanks to improved retention and understanding. Chunking is a powerful learning strategy that simplifies complex information, making it more manageable and easier to remember. By effectively breaking down and organizing material into chunks, learners can enhance their memory, understanding, and overall efficiency in learning, whether for academic study, professional development, or personal growth. Incorporating chunking into your learning routine can significantly improve your ability to absorb and retain information. Here is an analogy that I always like to compare it to. Information needs to be condensed down in a different form to make it easier to interpret and understand. For me, information is like eating a raw, large steak. I can either try to eat the whole thing all at once, which will make me sick and give me hours worth of stomach aches and cramps. Some people can do that, but for me, I can't. To be more effective of how I can eat it and digest it, I can cook it to make it less gamey, put steak sauce on top to make it more edible, and cut it into thinly slices of tiny pieces for easier consumption, better absorption, and have better enjoyment. So same way with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. How can I break and chunk the information of like learning a specific Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu technique from, again, usually from a video tutorial, to make it easier for my brain to digest and memorize? If it can take high effort to slowly try to memorize a whole technique, how about instead, to avoid giving high effort and slow results, we break the technique into smaller, low effort, manageable pieces and easily memorize it all faster? So I thought about it for a while and finally came up with a solution to make use of chunking by converting Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques into this code form that I made. It's in a way my own sort of puzzle solving language that is an integral piece to my lazy method. To briefly sum it up, because it's a bit long to explain everything about it in this video, by chunking and condensing information into this code form that I made, I am able to break down the information to digestible pieces, categorizing, compartmentalizing, and organizing each piece and parts of a technique in a way that makes sense to me. Then, after successfully converting it the way I want, with this way of forming the information, I can now quickly trace, memorize, and review the tutorial of a technique much easier and faster without too much hassle of overloading my brain. In this code form, I made it so that every piece of information I try to study from a video tutorial of a technique becomes like a map that I can associate and relate information with, that just sort of links everything together and keeps my memorizing more organized and free-formed. This way of converting information requires me to read the code in a visualized way, where the code acts as a roadmap to help me follow to visualize in figuring out a pattern through association and relation, and guide me to figuring out the answer. The process of doing it this way is that my brain is more able to quickly form a deeper, understandable way or pattern that makes it easier to recall the whole information of a technique. To be clearer, I will give you an oversimplified example of my lazy code method that not only utilizes chunking method, but is also combined with another method. This relates to a method from actors trying to memorize a script faster for movies or TV shows. Here, I will give a ridiculous example sentence for you, the viewer, to memorize. Johnny went to the Apple store to buy Samsung phones, but the workers told him that they don't sell that. Johnny becomes enraged and tries to fight everyone in the store until the cops came. They arrested Johnny and threw him in jail for being disruptive in public. Not the best sentence I can come up with, but anyways, can you memorize this? To memorize this sentence word for word exactly, what most people do is try drilling it by rereading the sentence over and over again for who knows how long until they finally get it memorized and ingrained into their brain, which I bet the experience of doing it that way for most people can be annoying, takes more of your time than necessary, and depletes your precious mental energy quickly. Instead of trying to say that sentence over and over again until you painstakingly finally memorize it and strain that short-term memory, what I do instead to quickly and easily memorize this is first understand the story or the context of the sentence. That there is a man named Johnny who is throwing a fit in the Apple store. Once I have a basic understanding of the context of the sentence to prime my brain with, I then, with a piece of paper, take the first letter in every word in the sentence, add the plus sign in between them. It should look like this. Now read the normal sentence once and then try to read the sentence again in this code-like format. Your goal is to relate and associate this code form of the sentence to the story. Don't focus too much on trying to remember each of the letters associated with the words individually. Follow reading it by understanding the context of the story the best you can. Okay. Johnny went to the Apple store to buy Samsung phones, but the workers told him they don't sell that. Johnny becomes enraged and tries to fight everyone in the store until the cops came. They arrested Johnny and threw him in jail for being disruptive in public. I hope from this little demonstration or exercise helps that you would find it to be very much easier and helpful to understand the code portion of my lazy method. Overall, it almost feels like magic, like your brain just naturally and automatically recognizes in figuring out a relation and pattern based on any association and related information that it can extract from what you already know. And you should be able to decipher and read this without much problem. It is like some sort of brain hack to memorize in such an easy, weird way. Don't know exactly why this works, but overall, all I can say is that every letter acts as a hint and guidance for your brain to figure out and connect everything together, using relation and association in order to finally figure out in recalling the whole sentence accurately enough that makes reasonable sense, that again are based on already having a basic idea of the context of the sentence. Once you can read the sentence in this letter code form a couple of times successfully, now try reciting from just your head without looking at this code form. Starting with the first word, you will most likely find that you are more able to successfully memorize the pattern and can recite the whole sentence example more accurately and faster without too much struggle or stress at all. I highly recommend you try this method more in your own time. Test it out, because whether you are trying to memorize song lyrics, speeches, scripts, this will make your life easier to do those things.
So I've had it where I would try to be off book before everyone else. I would get it down to an acronym. So if there was 1,000 words I had to remember, I would just remember the first letter of each, and I would put it on a piece of poster board, and then I would stand away from it, not as far as you and your archery setup over there, but far enough away to where I can see it but kind of can't see it, back when my vision was a little more clear. And I would just run it and run it and run it.
Not exactly what this method is called, but for now, I would call this useful method that helps you memorize scripts or lines the pattern method. And with this pattern method, I wanted to see if I can tweak and modify it to not just memorize sentences or lines, but also Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu technique tutorials as well. Big jump, I know. If you haven't noticed or caught on to what I have been saying, I have been saying a lot about memorizing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques through using the idea of association and relation. This is important because you see, I learned that instead of forcing your energy-intensive brain to make more room to fit new information by trying to memorize through repetition, I find that it is easier and less energy demanding to use the power of association and relation instead. The power of association and relation is a highly effective way or process of thinking for enhancing memorization. It involves linking new information to existing knowledge or creating connections between different pieces of new information. Both the chunking and the pattern method, the way that I use them, heavily revolves around in taking advantage of this process or idea of memorizing things through association and relation by really focusing more on creating strong, meaningful connections in my mind to make memorization easier and more efficient. And from all my attempts to figure out a way to create a method that is all about using the power of association and relation, what resulted is that it led me to create this code thing. This code thing is really a huge part to my lazy method that helps me get results that I want. With this idea of the power of association and relation, I finally understood why a 2-hour movie could easily pass through to long-term memory while a simple name of somebody has a hard time staying in short-term memory. Well, the reasons why is because of association and relation. Remember Remembering a movie is generally easier due to the engagement of multiple senses, emotional and contextual cues, repetition, and the creation of a network of associations that aid in transferring information from short-term to long-term memory. In contrast, remembering a name often involves a brief and less engaging process that makes it harder to encode and retain. The main point is a movie has more information but has a low cognitive load because the process to memorize it is powerful. Watching a movie engages multiple senses and cognitive processes, which aids in deeper processing and better memory retention, while a name has less information but can have higher cognitive load, especially when you're dealing with meeting multiple people at once and how complex the pronunciation of names can be. But in a way, learning and remembering a name requires the brain to focus specifically on that single piece of information. To be honest, now that I think about it, saying that learning people's names can be a high cognitive load is a bit of a stretch or silly. Unless your goal is to memorize every single name of people you meet or see throughout your life, good luck with that, because I never met anyone that is able to do that. I just wanted to use learning names as some sort of common example that most people experience having a hard time with, because it seems like a simple task, but for some reason, it is hard to do. It turns out statistically that most people are bad at remembering names, and names are just one of those things that often get stuck in short-term memory and quickly fade from memory unless we put out more effort to keep it to memory. Most people that we meet throughout our life, there are really only a few that we bother to learn their names. Either it is because those people are relevant to our life, or they provoke and cause a certain level of emotional feeling in us to come out.
No.
Well, I guess it's time to say goodbye to the security guards whose names I never learned. Take care, Captain. Stay golden, Chief. Be well, buckaroo. Bye, Francesca Louise Alessandro. Say hi to Max and Samuel and your sister Eloise for me. And good luck with your night courses.
And if we look at it that way in perspectives, then names are pretty easy to memorize and has a pretty low cognitive load. In a way, when it comes to memorization, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques are similar to names, that they both always get stuck in short-term memory when you first learn them. So with memorizing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques specifically, let's give more context and sensory input to work with in getting them into long-term memory faster and easier. So yeah, by combining chunking method and the pattern method together, converting them into this code form and putting it to practice, the results is that whenever I want to learn a new technique from a video tutorial, it now has become a more effective and easier process to memorize. Using the chunking method, I am able to break and chunk almost any Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques I come across online into each of these what I call blocks. Each different blocks represent action, movements, imagination, ideas, details, and any associations that I can come up with to relate anything about the technique I would be breaking down at that moment. That when categorized, compartmentalized, and connected to each other will act as hints for my brain to follow to start putting the pieces together. And these pluses and other symbols that I use in my code method acts as connectors to each block, each having their own meaning that when placed in between the blocks will define the different interpretations and interactions of how the code for the information is presented. This chunking process helps me to start priming my brain by deeply taking time to think about the technique to really build a strong sense of familiarity. It is like I am creating questions for myself to figure out the answers to. When the chunking process is done and I try to read through the code form of that technique, beginning to end, in my attempt to figure out what I just wrote and figure out the meaning of why I wrote it this way through association and relation, that's when the pattern method kicks in of constantly thinking, how does all of this code relate and associate to anything about the subject or context of the technique I am trying to recall from memory. All of this will cause my brain to sorta enter a state of deciphering and making logical guesses that seem to make sense enough to fit the whole picture puzzle of the technique together to give meaning on what works and why it works, of understanding why each puzzle piece should fit the way it does. This is how my lazy method works in memorizing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques. When I do it this way, it almost feels like I am not doing most of the work as much, and my brain is handling all of it automatically for me instead to memorize the technique. Or to put it more simply another way, because I feel like what I just said there could still be confusing to understand. The way I read the code and how I use it as a way to memorize a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu technique, the goal is to always read going down the lines until I can reach to the end. As I am reading down the lines of the code, I am constantly putting my brain into a problem-solving state of figuring out which pieces should fall into place that makes reasonable sense enough that I can feel confident in by the time I reach reading the end of the last line of the code for that specific technique I want to memorize from a tutorial. I feel like the information by then, before I realize it, has already passed over my short-term memory and into my long-term memory without me trying much. To me, the process is so powerful that it prevents my brain from being able to prune and get rid of precious knowledge easily after I have memorized it. It is like I am tricking my brain to think all of this information I give it is worth keeping. Before we can get in any deeper, to be more clearer to what do I mean when I said by putting myself in a problem-solving state as I am reading the code, here is also another example. It is like a crossword puzzle. Every block I filled successfully with a word gives me another block line to figure out and connect the word's letters to. I always use the hints from every previous block that's been filled successfully by a letter or two. Use those as guidance to narrow down the word I am looking for that seem to fit the context in answering the provided definition or questions clues until I can finally make a good logical guess of what word definitely belongs there. Fill out the empty block slot, then keep branching from there until the whole word puzzle is completed. Each line of my lazy code going down are all connected to each other in some way. Every line I successfully am able to decode by problem solving will give me hints to solve the next line. It's like a snowball effect. It all just rolls and gets bigger until it finally forms a complete giant snowball snowball. Another example is, let's say you are driving to your friend's place from your house. You always used a GPS to go there because you naturally got no sense of direction. Can't go anywhere without it. You're like Zoro from One Piece, who is constantly getting lost. Now, one day you don't have a GPS available this time around, and you need to get to your friend's house for whatever reason. So now, if your house is point A and your friend's house is point C, you gotta figure out point B that connects the two in order to get to your friend's house. Point B is basically are all the landmarks that you definitely know to be signs or places that are between you and your friend's house. Even though you don't know how to get to your friend's house without a GPS, to start off, you at least do know how to get to a specific familiar restaurant that you always pass by whenever you go to your friend's place. If you go to that restaurant, you can feel like you're getting closer to your friend's place. Then, once you are at the restaurant, you have to think, what is the next place that you can figure out and use as a landmark that is close by to the restaurant and that you know for sure it's still heading into the direction towards your friend's place. As you keep on narrowing it down, heading to each familiar landmark, and constantly you just keep figuring out the next landmarks one after the other that can be signs and indicators to know that you are getting closer. That just makes the most logical sense until it finally helps you reach your friend's house. In a way, those landmarks all become part of point B. That's the problem solving part of my lazy method is focus on, of trying to fill the gaps in between of knowing where to start and where it ends. I have to think of ways of how pieces of point B can fit in my code method of being able to connect A to C that can make the most logical sense for a technique that I am trying to memorize work. To simply put, again, as long as you know where you start and you know where you want to end up at, all the pieces in the middle needs to make sense enough to lead you from beginning to the end. Every line of my code is a memory landmark, and to go to each landmark, I have to actively think and be engaged to figure out pieces of the answer in order to pass through them until I reach my final destination of solving the answer. This process of thinking is what I find helps to memorize a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu technique. It makes the idea of doing each step of a technique feel more common sense of why I am doing it this specific way, which just overall makes it easier for me to remember and recall the techniques. The whole process of doing it this way almost becomes like a game that I can easily enjoy solving and know that I am rewarded at the end, just in case to be clearer to stop any more confusion. If anyone who is asking whenever someone is looking at this code equation, no, I don't memorize this whole equation code looking thing. This equation looking code thing only serves as my guidance and for me to decipher and solve the answer, of only helping me make sense of understanding a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu technique that I am trying to memorize much better in a way that almost feels like instinctively I am just following a pattern that seems to lead me to the answer, helps me build an idea of a tangible way to get to the answer. Even if it's not the perfect way to get to the answer at first, I at least have a path to walk on to try to get to the answer, and I can always refine and fix the road later with more review and experience. With this way of processing information, I also think of it as is letting my mind naturally have the freedom and fun in getting to the answer as close to it as I can. Instead of stressing out and get frustrated from trying to always focus in landing on the exact or perfect answer, there is this term or phenomenon that I found interesting back when I first learned about it in my psychology class in high school, that suggests that people can understand the meaning of words in a sentence even when the inner letters of each word are jumbled, as long as the first and last letters remain in place. The concept is called typoglycemia. Here is an example. Tell me if you can read this. If you read it and got the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog, then you are seeing what I am seeing, hopefully. Unless you are seeing anything different, then comment down below the video. But overall strange that you can read this sentence correctly, even though it is all jumbled up like this, but your brain just automatically can just figure it out and read it like no problem. This concept highlights the brain's ability to interpret words based on context and familiarity with the language, rather than needing to analyze each letter individually in a way of how it is related to my method. When I reach to a certain level of comprehension of reading my code method, the results is that whenever I am reading down the code that I made to break down a certain technique that I am reviewing again from the Anki app, as long as I know the context and still have a sense of familiarity of how that certain Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu technique from a video tutorial plays out, especially still knowing how to start the technique and know how it should end, with just that limited amount of information to go off from to associate and relate to, my brain just gets better over time of doing the job for me in deciphering, filling the missing gaps of information, and making me think what's the most logical way in combining all the pieces of a technique together in a way that makes the most sense in order to connect and read all the code that is associated and related with the right movements together correctly enough, step by step, until I can finally reach the end to the desired outcome of remembering all the steps that is required in knowing how that certain technique should be performed in certain situations. Again, I probably one day will make a separate video to explain my lazy code method in further detail with demonstration, so please subscribe and wait for more. At this point, I am not really smart to explain on how my whole system works in more deeper scientific term or anything. To be honest, I got most of my scientific ideas and materials to write this essay by using ChatGPT and from watching a learning YouTuber named Justin Sung. Definitely check him out. He has a very interesting and powerful take when it comes to learning and how we should approach it. I am a very big fan. Justin Sung, if you ever watched this video, please critique this video, cause I kinda stole some of your statements from your videos to help try to support in explaining on the process of how my lazy method works and the research to make this video. Would love your input if I said or applied everything correctly. So guys, check him out, because he goes way more in depth to explain everything about the process of learning. Just letting you all know that I am just a guy who just wants to find an easier way to do things when necessary. Strangely, this amalgamation of mine that I made by chance just works for me somehow. But overall, if I am not too lazy to make my next video, I will try to explain it further. Note taking. Note Note-taking is a way for us to try to be more engaged and have a clearer understanding of the material that we are learning. It is something that we rely to review and help memorize the material. Your notes reflect your own learning style and emphasizes the points you find most important or challenging. Now, the question is, does the way that we currently take notes actually effective in helping us learn? This lazy code thing is my own form of note-taking for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It is what I put in the back of my digital flashcard in the Anki app. Whenever I research in memorizing a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu technique, there is this idea of note-taking I want to talk about. How note-taking should be. For me, instead of doing a form of what I call linear note-taking that I found most other people usually tend to do when they want to take notes on learning a new technique, which is by just writing a brief or as much description of each step of a technique that is very clear, detailed, and accurate, that gives the answer right away the second you look at it. When I see that approach, I just don't think that way of trying to review or memorize information is impactful and deep enough for someone like me. For me, I used to think that the more descriptive and information are added on to my notes, the more I think I was giving the brain more material to work with. But after gaining more personal experience in the methods of learning and memorization, now I think the more information is given about the material, the more I am not allowing the brain to work, to think, and make connections with the material. It's like, why should the brain think or remember the materials when looking at a note, when the notes already does the thinking and remembers the materials for it? Notes should be, in a way, helping the brain by testing it and getting it to think. But the notes can't test the brain's thinking when the answer is already easily given by the notes. It is like you are handicapping your own brain power. So that's why I created a new style in my own method to make note-taking work for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. My notes are pretty much non-verbal. Non-verbal as in it is trying to express ideas without using so many words or none at all. And when I show the brain my lazy code note, I feel like my brain works better, that my brain has a reason to think and make connections. My belief is that the more the brain can think and make connections with the material, the more chance it is for the material to be recognized as valuable and be memorized by the brain. It might seem counterintuitive, but I believe in this case, when it comes to taking notes, less is in a way better. My non-verbal note taking style is that I am able to give a lot of information in a different form that can still provoke the brain to think deeply about it without giving up the answer right away. But I always try to challenge my brain by providing as little information as I can with my code form when necessary. There is a bunch of research out there of how writing lots of notes accurately and descriptively can actually reduce the quality of your learning, because it probably means that you are not processing information as much before you write it down. Think about it this way. Imagine your notes to be like a gym partner that you work out with. They help spot you to make sure you are lifting the weights safely, engages you to stay focused, and encourages you to keep pushing and help you to make sure you are doing it right, that you are optimally and effectively gaining from your sessions. If it's a good gym partner, they would just do that to help guide you into doing the right process. If it's a bad gym partner, you won't be able to gain as much from your workouts. They will literally take most or even all of the weights off from your hands and give you a false sense of confidence that you can lift that weight. You need stimulation of some kind to grow. Just like building muscle, you need to do things that will facilitate enough physical stress and exertion to stimulate muscle growth. When it comes to memorization and learning complex things, you need to do things that will facilitate cognitive stress and processing that will stimulate those synapses in the brain to build that knowledge, to understand the complex things. Working out and lifting weights are what you do to stimulate muscle growth. Thinking and making connections is what you do to stimulate brain growth and build knowledge. So how are you going to grow effectively and optimally if your gym spotter or notes does most of the work for you? There has to be some balance that you can depend on the notes and fully rely on your own brain power capabilities. Making effective notes is a skill that helps us engage in the right thinking process to build the knowledge. Overall, I find that style of linear note-taking acts more of a reference to look at for the future and does not really facilitate thinking or cognitive process. It's like turning the notes into some sort of grocery list that you fully depend on to help you not think when shopping to stock up. You guys ever had one of those tests at school where the teacher allowed you to take the final test with a cheat sheet the size of a flashcard to use as a reference to help give you the answer? Some of you cheaters out there that I remember somehow found all the answers and literally crammed it all onto that tiny flashcard, like you did some hieroglyphing all night, instead of just consistently studying every day before the test. When it comes to learning, good note-taking should help our brain to think, not help it avoid thinking. And I feel like the linear note-taking style just gives up too much information that is, in a way, does not let the brain have enough freedom or range to deeply tap into that thinking pattern-solving state through using association and relation. The brain naturally likes to find patterns and solve problems. The brain's natural drive to find patterns and solve problems is a fundamental aspect of human cognition, developed through evolutionary pressures and is essential for learning, adaptation, and social functioning. I feel like my lazy method does a good job in really taking advantage of the brain's natural inclination, emphasizes and forcing it on to make learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques more efficiently for myself, which is what the code part of my lazy method is mostly all about, and it just magically helps me memorize techniques much better and faster. Keeps me engaged to really encode the information of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and turn it into memory. It's my way of nudging my brain to the right direction and trusting its thinking process to get to the right place. Now, I am not trying to knock on linear note-taking. If most people find that it works for them, then they should keep doing it. But for me, it does not work. And I think my method of nonverbal note-taking is better for me. So the question is, does your note-taking style effective for you? When looking back at all of the ideas of making memorization of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques easier, this brings me back to when I was learning Japanese. Learning a language and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is similar because when I see the main thing people try to do in order to memorize techniques, and that is by using rote learning, by physically drilling the technique hundreds of times with a complacent partner until they are confident enough that they have it finally memorized and ingrained the technique to their head for the long term. I view this way to be too much of a process for a lazy guy like myself to do. Again, I view it as trying to learn Japanese characters. There are thousands of characters, and trying to memorize one seems really hard. Usually, the old way of how people memorize a single character was that they would write it over hundreds of times on a chalkboard or paper until they finally memorized the character. So much time and effort spent. To me, that sounds inefficient, and I thought if there could be a better way to learn and memorize Japanese characters easier that doesn't require a lot of stress and effort to do, then it could save me so much trouble and time. Luckily, someone did figure it out and wrote a book on how to memorize Asian characters faster, easier, and better. The book was called Remembering the Kanji by James W. Hiesig. Hopefully, I am pronouncing that right. But after reading the book, it showed me a method to chunk information by using imagery and storytelling in a way where it can help me be able to memorize hundreds of Japanese characters in a single day with no stress. Memorizing the characters became so easy that you just feel like you have photographic memory, and that's how good the method was from this book. It focuses more on the process of using the power of association and relation by using imagery and storytelling to relate to the Japanese kanji characters. This method is way better than writing each and every single character hundreds of times, no doubt. In a way, I find it to be very interesting of trying to understand how the brain works, because once the human brain can detect a familiar pattern, it starts to make very logical and subconscious predictions of what is going to happen next through association and relation. And that is what my method basically tries to take advantage of in order to help memorize Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques easier. With this lazy code method, I am able to create a sense of familiarity quickly with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques. After using the code to memorize a certain technique, every time I find myself in a position or step on using that certain technique for the first time when rolling with somebody, I am already able to have a good sense of knowing how to use that technique, of knowing where I am with it, and be more daring to try to progress going over from one position or step to another to execute doing the technique while fighting against the resistance from my rolling partner, to really have more confidence to try the newly memorized technique out during the live roll instead of just staying in a stuck position, panicking and holding on to dear life, having my mind race of thinking what to exactly do next, and in the end, not really having a real overall productive role of being able to experiment on physically trying to use that technique. I want to learn and try new things in my roles. I don't want to just try to survive and only get beaten up by them. I bet most of you guys out there who have gone through the white belt phase know what I am talking about. How, as a beginner grappler, when it comes to rolling, you are only expected to focus on survival, and it will get old quickly if you don't learn how to survive better the next time you do it. So, the code language thing that is part of my method, in a way, helps me memorize a technique much faster and easier without much of the repetitiveness. It is what I find to be somewhat similar to how using math works. To tackle solving a certain problem in giving it a structure that when you plug in the right numbers into the equation, you are basically funneling down to get to the answer using the various formulas. I find this process, when implemented, makes my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu training experience overall process less tedious and less of a headache to do. Instead of just drilling a technique over many times until the technique starts to make sense, which can be slow and tedious for me, I get better results of using this method of mine to help make sense of the technique faster and easier. This is basically my passive way or bypass in being able to absorb as much information efficiently as I can without feeling overwhelmed or overloading the short-term memory or sacrificing too much of my mental resource in order to do so, that I can just pursue to learn Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as a lazy white belt more naturally, confidently, and efficiently. Visualization and active recall method. In order to read my lazy code method, the next piece of the puzzle is that I have to read it in a visualized way, meaning you have to use something called visualization. If you don't know what visualization is, to sum up visualization is a very cool thing that most people do on a daily basis. You're stuck at school and lecture is boring. To escape that boredom, you imagine yourself finally at home playing your favorite video game. Just imagining pressing the controls and commands to defeat that boss that you are stuck in. Or you are watching a street fight video that just gets you pumped up, imagining yourself of how would you fight if you were in that person's situation in the video. Or you are starving and you visualize what that food you are finally going to eat later on is gonna taste like, salivating at the thought of finally getting it in your hands. You get what I mean with visualization now? I was inspired by the idea of using visualization in my method from coming across watching videos of chess players playing chess games blindfolded against multiple people, just amazed at how incredible it is that they are able to visualize and play all of those moves and strategies in their head like that. And I thought if I can apply it to my martial arts training, I wanted to know how effective could it be to my progress in memorizing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques. Visualization or mental imagery involves creating mental images or scenarios to rehearse physical activities without physically doing them. In martial arts, practitioners might visualize performing a technique, sequence, or sparring scenario. Even if Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioners don't particularly heavily rely on visualization as a way to train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, overall, in some way, I am sure for many Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioners out there that can relate when it comes to everyday life, are using visualization lightly as a form of escape from reality or as a way to prep themselves before a tournament. In my case, when I am bored or doing some mundane things that doesn't take much mental effort, like doing dishes, vacuuming, walking, I probably imagine in my head being on the mats, rolling with another person to pass the time. But in a way, I feel like a lot of people overlook in the potential on visualization when it comes to learning martial arts. There is a perceived complexity that the concept of visualization can seem abstract or esoteric, leading some to assume it's too complex or mystical rather than a practical training tool. Or there is a more traditional focus and belief that martial arts training traditionally emphasizes physical practice, which are physically going over techniques, drills, and sparring. This belief can lead participants to undervalue non-physical training methods like visualization. I don't blame anyone because visualization does sound stupid and holistic in a way. But to me, I believe visualization overall is a powerful tool that we have in our brains that we could utilize to our advantage. I believe that when applied optimally the right way, can be used as another way to help in learning and memorizing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques effectively. That the idea of visualizing going over the steps of a technique can help reinforce muscle memory and comprehension. When I am not attending the gym as much as I should be, or I have reasons that I can't be at the gym as often, then visualizing doing jiu-jitsu in my head is a good alternative and practice for me to just make up for those times of spending that time imagining myself in various positions and think through the different techniques I would apply in various situations, of really going over them step by step. This mental rehearsal that I always try to do, I believe can benefit in actually improving my decision making and reaction times on the mats at the gym in real life. There are some studies out there that shows that visualization in theory, when applied in sports or martial arts, to be scientifically proven to be effective. Don't believe me? Google it. I am too lazy at this point in doing more research to point those studies out. So here are just the 3 key points that shows the effects that visualization can have in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu training. Theoretically, neuromuscular training. Even when physically still, visualizing movements can activate the same neural pathways used during physical execution. This mental practice can lead to improvements in physical performance. Enhancement of technique. Visualization allows for mental rehearsal of techniques in great detail, including posture, movement, and even response to an opponent's actions. Stress reduction and confidence building. It can help reduce performance anxiety and build confidence by mentally rehearsing successful outcomes and strategies. Again, to me, to make it simple, visualization is better than nothing on days when I can't physically train and show up to my gym. Visualization can be my own little gym simulation in a way that I can always enter in and go over techniques whenever I feel like it. Now, with visualization, I don't want to just aimlessly visualize out of random with no real sense of direction or focus. There has to be a strategy to it, and that is to make my visualization more efficient, intentional, and organized that produce real results of helping me feel like I am actually memorizing techniques in a very clear and detailed way that has purpose and direction. So how? Well, I find that when using visualization and combining it together with my lazy code method, I am able to guide my visualization in a more effective, intentional, purposeful, and organized process in memorizing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques from video tutorials. This process I do as I am visualizing and trying to guide it with my lazy code results in something called active recalling, which is basically another learning method. Active recall is the practice of actively stimulating memory during the learning process through testing oneself rather than passively reviewing or reading the material. In martial arts, this could involve quizzing oneself on the sequence of movements, techniques, or strategies without immediately looking at the reference material. The benefits of active recall from studies include enhanced memory retention. Actively retrieving information strengthens neural pathways, making it easier to recall information in the future. Identification of knowledge gaps. It helps learners identify what they know well and what they need to focus on, directing their study efforts more efficiently. Overall, active recall is a highly effective study strategy because it forces you to engage with the material, making it easier to remember and understand in the long term. Key features of active recall that my method takes advantage of is questioning. By actively questioning myself about the material that I am trying to learn, this could involve using flashcards, self-quizzing, or having someone else test me. Retrieval practice. Recalling information from memory without looking at the source material. This strengthens neural pathways associated with the knowledge. Since again, my lazy code method is non-verbal and does not give up the answer easily, but only gives me a path to follow in figuring out out the answer by visualizing for it, forcing, quizzing, and testing my brain through this process. Overall, triggers a very effective active recall in a way of how I would describe it as that it is my constant way to trick my brain into thinking it knows the answer to the questions, but still have to make sure it is the right answer by deciphering and make logical guesses for it. I am constantly questioning my thinking to see if the way I am performing the technique that I am thinking of in my head visually makes sense enough to fit into the code. And at the same time, I am hitting the retrieval process when it comes to reading this code by trying to actively recall everything I know about the technique that could help me solve each line of the code. This way of doing it, I find helps strives in the knowledge of memorizing a technique much deeper to my long-term memory, faster and easier. Space, repetition, and data. The amount of information an individual retains after learning something new can vary widely based on several factors. Learning method, the individual's cognitive abilities, the material's complexity, and the use of reinforcement techniques. However, a general model that gives us some insight into memory retention over time is the forgetting curve, conceptualized by Hermann Ebbinghaus in the late 19th century. Yeah, sorry if I butchered that name. Ebbinghaus' forgetting curve suggests that memory retention declines exponentially over time without any attempt to retain the information. Here's a rough outline of how retention might decrease over time if the learner does not review the material, especially when it comes to skill acquisition and retention of learning new Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques for beginners. After 1 hour, retention can drop to around 50% of the material, depending on the complexity of the information and the individual's focus during the learning session. After 24 hours, retention can decrease further, with individuals remembering only about 20 to 30% of the material. After a week, without review, retention can decline to 10 to 15% of the original material learned. After a month, retention may stabilize around this time, but at a level where much of the detail is lost, and only the gist or a few details of what was learned might be remembered. To summarize, without any review or attempt to retain, a significant portion of new information can be forgotten within days to weeks. But with the application of effective review and repetition methods, it can greatly improve the retention of information over longer periods. For me, it used to be that every time I attend my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu class and after, I always feel like I barely was able to retain of what was taught at class. Also, factoring in if I barely follow up with what I learned and only show up to class 1 to 2 times a week within that week or so. In the end, I feel like I probably lost 100% of what I learned from that class. Just forget it all and it just feels like a waste. And I just hate wasting good knowledge that I had been taught. But again, still pretty much my fault. So far in this video, I showed the process part of my method that helped me to comprehend and understand techniques much faster and better through tutorials. That is effective enough for me that I feel confident that I can still remember what I learned after almost sometimes a week without review. But still, I needed to absolutely guarantee that I won't forget anything in the long run. Whether it's been months or years, I needed an effective repetition review method to ensure everything that I memorized will not fade for a while and stay for the long term. Repetition in learning is important to maintain what you learn or memorize. It is often always best to review what you learned so that you can further add on and sharpen it with new materials and experience. Later on, the term term for the brain is use it or lose it, meaning if you don't use or review the information that you just memorized, your brain will think it is not that important to hold on and will get rid of it. Even though I criticize repetition for being a terrible way to memorize new information, which I argue the process is more important, but repetition still plays an important role, and that is to review information. The most common and old way that I was taught to use to help review information was something called daily repetition method. The idea is that you have to constantly keep up reviewing information almost every day to ensure that you will almost never forget it, or at least you have it ingrained enough to your memory that you don't need to give any further review. And it really emphasizes the rule to review almost every day. For clarification, daily repetition method and rote learning, they both sound like they are the same method, but here is the little difference. Rote learning is how you approach memorizing new information. Daily repetition method is how you approach reviewing old information to get consecutively as many days as you can to review information, which I am not a big fan of doing, because daily repetition method is not flexible and convenient for me to do unless I am more dedicated and committed to make it work. But overall, looking at daily repetition method, I think the repetition of reviewing information shouldn't be done over excessively like that, of feeling like I am being pressured to do it every day for a certain period of time to make it work. Instead, I believe it should be done more in a strategical way that is less stressful and more optimal for me to do to realistically keep up with my learning and memorization of knowledge that I want to retain. As used to being a beginner grappler, we are taught that using the daily repetition method with the drilling method is the solution to help combat the forgetting curve. But you have to make sure you do enough of it to be effective, because doing it the traditional way of just drilling a technique you are trying to learn and memorize for an hour one time will not mean you will remember it forever, guaranteed. Just like that. For most people, that is not how it works. Whatever information you just tried to shove to your memory after a session will start to quickly fade away if you don't put effort to try to review and retain it. You need to make sure to continuously and consistently follow up with what you know by reviewing enough to the point where it finally becomes super engraved to your memory, where you feel confident that you don't have to worry about ever forgetting it for a while. And again, if your primary method to learn and memorize new techniques by just using the drilling method, from my understanding is that approaching the drilling method requires that you need to make sure you can drill as much as you can by using the daily repetition method appropriately enough most days of the week, or ideally every day if you can. That way you can have a higher chance to constantly memorize, review, solidify, refine, and build from what you know or what you want to learn. And if you can't do that daily repetition method alongside the drilling method of following the traditional way, then you will find it to be more harder or not as effective to learn and memorize Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques by using only the drilling method at unorganized random times. That's why, going back to when I say using the drilling method as the only way to memorize techniques is not always practical for me, because I almost have to do it every day using the daily repetition method to ensure that I am able to use, review, and retain the knowledge. My reasons why I believe it is not practical or convenient for me to consistently do is that there are just so many requirements to prep beforehand in order to drill effectively that I find has friction and obstacles that can be annoying at times. There's finding the right partner, scheduling, finding a place to train, going there, and if all goes well, finally meeting up to actually drill. But there can be other possible additional variables or problems to deal with when it comes to trying to drill. I just want a way that could make the process of reviewing and retaining Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques frictionless, of not requiring a lot in order to do and be more in my control, in a way to work well enough that even if I ever planned to drill with another person and they cancel on me the last minute, which is alright, cause we all got things going on in our life. All I am saying from all of this is that nothing ever always goes smoothly, that there are variables that can disrupt the traditional way of training. That includes if I got sick or I am injured and can't physically train for months. I want to have a backup plan that I could still do in order to at least help review and retain knowledge of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques, which is why I find my lazy method to be very reliable in such cases. Overall, I just don't want to deal with a hassle or problem when it comes to trying to drill almost every day. Again, I think I am not that committed enough yet to do it that way. In a way, what I am saying is that I want to drill as little as possible. I don't want to feel pressured to do it every day, and I just want to make the overall experience of learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques more convenient process of being able to just jump straight into memorizing and reviewing anytime and anywhere I want, without having for me to plan ahead or think about it. I wanted to find the best review method to help me retain the knowledge of techniques much easier and convenient for a lazy guy like me. Something I can do that doesn't require me to do every day or have obstacles to jump over. So with the time I spent researching and experimenting, I found that the best and most effective repetition review method that fits my needs, that works alongside with my lazy method, and that is something called space repetition. Like I mentioned earlier in the video, it's a memory review method where you are spacing out what you want to review in a wide range of intervals over time, and it has been shown effective to flatten the forgetting curve, meaning this reviewing method I found can effectively help make retaining information in much longer periods in a way that doesn't require me to always need to review the material as much. Or another way to put it, that I don't need to constantly stress in trying to review something every day in order to have it stick to my head long term. I can space it all out and be able to review the material more comfortably and conveniently within my control. Space repetition method is generally considered more effective than daily repetition method for several reasons. Optimal timing for review. Space repetition involves reviewing information at increasing intervals, which helps reinforce memory just as it begins to fade. This timing enhances long-term retention better than daily repetition, which can lead to diminishing returns. Memory consolidation. By spacing out reviews, the brain has more time to consolidate information, transforming it from short-term to long-term memory more efficiently. This process takes advantage of how our brains naturally strengthen memories over time with proper reinforcements. Reduced cognitive load. Spacing out study sessions reduces cognitive load, preventing burnout and making it easier to focus during each session. Daily repetition can lead to fatigue and decreased effectiveness over time. Enhanced retrieval practice. Space repetition forces the brain to actively retrieve information, strengthening neural connections and making it easier to recall information in the future. This active recall is more effective than passive review. Better engagement. By varying the intervals and mixing up the material, space repetition keeps learning sessions more engaging and less monotonous compared to daily repetition, which can become tedious and less stimulating. Efficiency. Space repetition optimizes study time, allowing learners to spend less time reviewing material while achieving better retention compared to the constant grind of daily repetition. Overall, space repetition leverages the brain's natural learning processes, leading to more efficient and effective long-term retention of information. Again, space repetition works by presenting information at increasing intervals, counteract counteracting the natural tendency to forget and thereby reinforcing memory over time. For example, I have a flashcard that I use for memorizing a technique, and on the front is the name of the tutorial of the technique, and on the back is the lazy code I wrote for that tutorial. My process in how I review it is that if I am able to read this code on the back successfully enough that I could confidently judge to be an overall successful review process, in being able to understand the code to recall the knowledge associated with the technique video tutorial of this card, then I would confidently determine that I won't need to see and review this specific card again for another 2 days. And once 2 days has passed, and if I am able to successfully review this card again, then I would increase the card to 4 days of not reviewing it. The more I get the card correct of reviewing this certain technique successfully each time, then the more I keep increasing the length of time of when to review this card again. The goal is to make it so that my memory retention on that specific card is so good that I will rarely ever need to have to review it again, or as long as possible, because the knowledge of that card at that point has become so ingrained to my long-term memory. Spaced repetition leverages the forgetting curve by letting me schedule reviews at key intervals. After learning a new piece of information, I am prompted to review it after a short period, just before I forget it. Subsequent reviews occur at progressively longer intervals, allowing me to reinforce the memory just as it begins to fade again. As a result of applying spaced repetition with flashcards that is written in my lazy code method, I am really able to amplify the retention process. I currently have cards that I won't have to see and review again for 2 years, but I feel confident that when 2 years goes by and I review them again, I can still remember their contents. This is how good the method of spaced repetition is, and I am glad that I am able to apply it well to my method. Now, if I get the card of a specific technique tutorial that I was in the process of reviewing wrong, basically couldn't read my lazy code method that I could judge satisfactory successful enough, or just missing a couple of pieces in trying to interpret the code, or just completely forgot it all, then I will start the review process all over again back to day one, making sure to pay more attention to that specific card in memorizing its contents, revise and edit if necessary, and then work my way back up in getting that card to as many days to years as much as I can of not having to review it again. This way of reviewing information helps me to separate and discern techniques that I strongly memorize to the back of the line, the ones that does not need much attention or priority because I am confident in recalling them, separately away from techniques that I feel that I am weak at recalling and need to work in putting more of my focus and attention to. Overall, spaced repetition has proven by a lot of studies to be very effective and is widely used by people who are in the medical field to help increase their retention to learn complex medical terms, or for people who are language learners to help increase their retention with learning vocabulary. Like I said earlier in the video, I don't use the traditional paper flashcards no more for spaced repetition, because mostly when it comes to organizing a bunch of physical paper cards for spaced repetition, especially when you reach to a point of having hundreds to thousands of them, it just becomes annoying and a hassle to keep track of trying to schedule each card's intervals individually by hand. Instead of doing it that way, I use the application called Anki, which uses digital flashcards instead that are easy to make and carry within my phone. And overall, the Anki software just automates the reviewing and retention process for me. The app is very customizable. You can set the Anki's app's algorithm to the way that you want and making it adapt better in adjusting the intervals of how often you want to review information based on what you think is optimal for your performance. Again, the concept is still pretty simple. If you recall an item correctly, the interval to the next review increases. If you forgot, the interval shortens, ensuring more frequent reviews until the information is retained. No more trying to figure out what cards needs to be separated from the ones that I strongly memorize to the ones that I am having trouble memorizing and need more focus working on. This Anki app will do all the work for me in organizing and figuring out everything. I find this to be more convenient than carrying a bunch of paper flashcards to everywhere I go. And again, it makes it way more convenient of having a computer software tell me what to study, to review, and to improve my memorization retention on each and every flashcards, than to figure that out all by myself, mid-maxing in a way that saves some brain energy for other things like trying to figure out what I am going to eat for dinner later, or what Netflix show I am going to watch next. So overall, spaced repetition with the Anki software is a really nice addition that I added to my method that helps maintain and increase the retention of memorizing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques to even further long-term memory, and pretty much automates the way I train and study Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, giving me valuable data of which Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques that is giving me the most trouble and what I should focus more on, as well as giving me a sense of progress and control, because the Anki app that I use also has a feature of giving me a bunch of pie charts and statistics of my progress, which I find very helpful because it's motivating to see growth of progress represented as graphs of how much techniques I was able to successfully memorize. Physical application and refinement. There is a saying that theory without practice is meaningless. Now, lastly, the most important part. I eventually realized what it means to actually learn when it comes to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I may have learned to memorize Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques more effectively, but to really know how to use and be skillful of the techniques that I have memorized, there is another different type of level in learning that I need to do and reach towards. And that is something called true deep learning. In the context of education and cognitive science, true deep learning extends beyond mere memorization of facts or information. It involves a deep understanding, critical thinking, problem solving, and ability to apply knowledge in various contexts. So to be clear, I can memorize as much technique as much as I want using this method of building my knowledge. But if I think that only knowing how to visually do these techniques in my head is enough to effectively learn Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, that would be foolish. That is, in essence, is not fundamentally how real learning truly works for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu.
Landry, next thrower.
It's easy, Hill. Visualize the action, then actualize the vision.
Okay.
For the best results and real progress, especially looking at the most skillful people who have reached performing at the high level in the sport, of how they train and learn Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to eventually become high level, they all learn by doing things and by experimentation, not by being told this massive laundry list of things to remember. By the very essence of the art, ever since it was invented, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu heavily relies on something called kinesthetic learning, which is learning through physical activities and movements. This kinesthetic learning plays the important of learning through experimentation and experience process. Here are the benefits of kinesthetic learning when it comes to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Physical execution. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques involve specific movements and positions that must be practiced physically to understand how they feel and how effective they are against an opponent. Body awareness. Practice Practicing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu helps develop a heightened sense of body awareness, which is essential for executing moves correctly and adjusting them in response to an opponent's actions. Muscle memory. Repeated physical practice helps build muscle memory, allowing practitioners to perform complex movements automatically without needing to consciously think through each step during a match. Tactical adaptation. Kinesthetic learning in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu includes adapting to the feel of an opponent's movements and resistance, which is crucial for deciding on and switching techniques in real time during sparring or competition. Feedback integration. Immediate physical feedback from instructors and training partners helps refine techniques. This feedback is often kinesthetic, such as adjustments to grip, posture, or pressure, which are best understood through physical sensation. Therefore, kinesthetic learning is not just beneficial but necessary for making real progress to mastering Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, as the sport's essence is deeply rooted in physical practice and experience. This is probably why taking the rite of passage of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is important and is encouraged for every beginner to start doing. That showing up to the gym as much as they can, so they can always try to be in an ideal environment where they are constantly exposed to kinesthetic learning, of taking classes, going over techniques, and rolling. Overall, being in such a rich physical environment would lead to having a higher chance to effectively work on and hone their skills using kinesthetic learning, which is why the reasons of using drilling and different variations of it is all about. You got passive drilling, you got resistance drilling, you have situational drilling, you got combo drilling, which really are many different ways to physically train to learn new techniques and sharpen your skills with them, that are all part of the kinesthetic learning experience in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Then there are other unique methods and approaches that I found that uses kinesthetic learning, like Kit Dales, who is a 2-time world pro champ and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, who has his own concepts and ideas of how beginners to advanced practitioners of how they should approach learning and memorize techniques more effectively using kinesthetic learning. In the end, my method alone is not enough to effectively learn Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu when compared to just doing kinesthetic learning every day. But I believe there is still a potential to my overall method, that no matter the type of kinesthetic learning there is, when I combine my lazy method together with it and apply it to my training, in my experience so far in doing that, it made my kinesthetic learning way more easier, flexible, and efficient process to do at my own pace, as well as less of a frustrating mental experience in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu training. Again, my method and kinesthetic learning of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu goes great hand on hand for how I want to train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I may have the memory of a technique instruction manual in my head, but I need to build the muscle memory to make it happen. In being able to actually bring out and work on the physical action of using the technique, using kinesthetic learning, I believe really works best in building the muscle memory aspect. Here is another clarification of what do I mean by this. Having knowledge of techniques won't be effective enough if I don't try to physically test and put them to use on the mats by using kinesthetic learning. This method of mine can only get me so far of only helping me memorize and know the gist of the step-by-step on how to recall a technique much easier. But the last important piece is that I have to make sure I refine and polish them by actually trying to apply all of these technique theories on an actual resisting human being from all different sizes and shapes. Trial and error through physical experimentation and practical experience. I will understand a lot more in building the right type of muscle memory. And that is the value of fixing and adapting from any mistakes with how I perform or execute the techniques in certain situations that I may find myself in when training Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. The mindset of trying to constantly improve from fixing and learning from my mistakes is a crucial ability to have in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. No one is perfect. We all can make mistakes. But the most important thing is, are we aware of our mistakes? Thanks to my method, it at least has become easier to recognize, fix, and memorize mistakes when you already have most of the technique you are working on memorized. Cause it's hard to memorize mistakes when you don't have any much material on the subject in your head to attach it to and correct the error. Making mistakes in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is not fun if I can't remember and learn from them. It just becomes a frustrating experience. But the most important thing is that I always need to make sure I become aware of the mistakes first, which I mostly rely on people who are higher belts that can help me spot them. How can we have the option to be better and learn from our mistakes when we aren't aware of them in the first place? There are times where it is necessary that we need others to legitimately point the mistakes out for us when we can't see them. If you aren't aware of your mistakes and you always think you can do everything correct by yourself, that mindset can be detrimental to your whole learning progress in the long run. So therefore, I find that being able to have more awareness of my mistakes means that the more I know things, the more I am able to overcome them. Again, learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is not just about knowing the techniques, but also delivering them with the correct pressure, execution, and timing. There is a limit to how far knowledge alone can get you to. You need experimentation and experience to advance forward to help in building real skill. Nowadays, every time I do go to my gym, I use that opportunity to always seek feedback from my training partners and my instructors as much as I can, because constructive criticism or advices can help me refine my skills and improve my memory of the techniques that I am working on. If you want to constantly improve and grow more efficiently, you always need constant feedback. Even high-level athletes at the top still need constant feedbacks from their coaches. And if not, why would coaches exist in the first place? So that they can keep improving their performance and have a high chance to remain at the top of the sport. Like learning a language, you can memorize the vocabulary and grammar as much as you want, but to truly build in knowing how to use them and be skillful with them, if you want to reach a certain level of fluency, you have to take what you know and make sure you practice and gain experience speaking that language with another person. Ideally to someone who is a master of that language who can make you aware and correct your mistakes. Constantly talking and testing yourself. And with every session, you get better each time, fixing and improving any flaws or mistakes over time until the level of speaking becomes automatic and has reached to a point of clear communication of being able to express yourself freely. So my main point to all this is that just knowing the techniques doesn't mean you could use them correctly right away, but it is better to still know it and have it ready than to not know it. Cause how are you going to one day be prepared to try it out or practice with it and put what you know to the test to improve, or have anyone able to help you be aware of your mistakes if you still don't know anything to begin with or have anything you know to work with? So having knowledge already prepared beforehand can make a big difference of acquiring new skills to be a better experience. There was a thing that I watched from John Danaher on the Lex Friedman podcast, is that knowledge is the first step in building skill. In my way, with my lazy method, I am basically preparing myself and memorizing the schematics of a technique beforehand. Then when I have the chance, refine the technique through kinesthetic learning whenever I show up to my gym to physically train. I find that doing this way just makes the whole process of going over and acquiring new techniques, then building the skills on how to perform them correctly, to be more organized, smooth, and way less of a headache or mental exhaustion for not only just me, but my training partner as well. Here is an example for more clarity. Only using kinesthetic learning to learn a new Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu technique is like assembling new furniture. Imagine I just bought a furniture from IKEA and I need to follow the instruction manual to assemble that furniture together. In a way, instead of just opening and going at it by putting the furniture together, and at the same time relying constantly flipping back and forth the pages of the instruction manual to see if I am following it correctly. With all that brief waste moments of struggle to constantly stop what I am doing and taking another minute to go look at the instruction manual until I finally attach all the pieces together, then realizing I did it the wrong way or missed some pieces, then running back again to figure out the instruction manual over and over until I finish assembling the whole furniture correctly. Instead of that kind of headache where I feel more mentally exhausted by the end, I would rather just memorize all the content of the instruction manual the best I can beforehand using my lazy method. Have the knowledge prepared well enough so that whenever I actually make time to physically assemble the furniture together using kinesthetic learning, my time can focus on just assembling the furniture only, with less friction and headache of not having to juggle back and forth to constantly open and look at the instruction manual again or as much. I find that this way of acquiring or going over a new technique, I feel that it is a less mentally exhausting experience, that I find myself more deeply engaged during the process, and that by the end, I feel way more confident in my abilities to recall in assembling techniques from start to finish. How many of us who are trying to learn a new Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu technique from a video tutorial, those times where we try to learn from them while at the same time physically try to assemble what they teach us together with a partner, it can become a frustrating experience of trying to do both learning and assembling all at once. When you are going over a technique and have to constantly stop what you are doing at the moment because you keep forgetting the steps of that technique, then have to go back to rewatching the video tutorial again to find what you are missing, deal with all of those annoying YouTube ads along the way, finally find and figure out the missing pieces that you are looking for, and finally able to continue from where you were stuck on. Then eventually you forgot another step. Rinse and repeat. I find this to be very annoying and a frustrating thing that just keeps on disrupting and ruins the moment to fully be engaged in the assembling process of a technique. Friction in destroying the mood to really have fun to explore the mechanics of a technique. Lack of prepared knowledge and forgetfulness is the problem. An example is like you're getting it on for the first time in your life. You feel like you are doing everything right so far, but in the middle of it, before you can reach that finish line, you ruin the mood by watching a tutorial on how to put a wrap on. Jokes aside, it was the best example I could come up with. So to sum it up, be prepared so you can be in the moment. I believe if I am able to memorize the instruction manual of a technique I want to work on, to have it be easily memorized and have it in my head beforehand, so that when I do have time to show up to my gym to physically train, I would have an overall easier and great time to physically assemble that technique together, refine it, improve it, and have less of a frustrating experience in doing so. The ways that I physically assemble a technique together, well, part of the kinesthetic process is that I use drilling for that main purpose. Even though I hated drilling, criticize it throughout this video, and used to avoid doing it because it reminds me of my bad experience with rote learning in the past, after inventing and applying this lazy method to my overall training, I feel like I finally saw the true value of drilling, and I see it more as a tool for a different purpose. Again, not a tool to use for memorizing techniques, because using it for that purpose I found to be a headache or difficult process to do, and not as effective way to memorize things for myself, in my honest opinion. Instead, I see drilling and different variations of it to be more like a cherry on top to physically assemble, refine, and polish the techniques that I have visually memorized into skill. With that in mind, drilling to me now feels less like a chore chore, less of a frustration, and that I am able to actually enjoy doing it. So memorize the techniques using my lazy method will be faster and easier for my non-serious lifestyle. Then whenever I get the chance to physically train, I use the drilling methods to refine and polish those techniques so they can become more automatic to do. That would lead me to build the skills and deepen my understanding on using them properly, which making them more effective to use in tournaments or in my hard rolls with somebody on the mats. And so far, I find that being able to separate the stress of memorizing techniques and the stress of drilling or going over them at the gym, instead of cramming it all into one session, to be more of a very less stressful and more enriching experience to deeply learn Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Here is another analogy. If the brain had a door for materials to go through, if I am using rote learning or drilling as a way to process information to go through that door by repetition, then to me it is like trying to constantly and frustratingly push the large material enough times to squeeze through that door until it finally goes in. My lazy method is my way to make it easier to bring the material through the door by breaking it apart to smaller, manageable pieces first. Then once it's inside, I use the kinesthetic learning and drilling to assemble the pieces back together and refine the material to the desired level that I want. And trust me, I feel like it's a lot easier to refine and improve the material when it's already inside my head. Yeah, imagine finally being able to physically work on techniques with a partner or master without having much or any trouble at all of remembering how to do them. With the integration of all of these memory and learning techniques that I apply together as a daily practice, along with here and there physical training at my gym, as a result, I believe I was able to make up for my lack of overall training, get the most out of my training for whenever I show up to the gym, and finally make progress in building my foundation. Again, I see my method as a potential way that no matter how I approach training Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, whether I am lazy or dedicated with it, I can still make the best out of the situation somehow by still maximizing learning outcomes, performance, and improvements at my own pace. Conclusion and overview. Making progress in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu can be slow, tedious, and frustrating for most people who are new to grappling. That's because overall, getting into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu has a hard barrier to entry for beginners that requires you to do and learn many things so that you can eventually get good enough to have actual fun experience in the art and progress even further of being skillful at it. And it's hard to almost impossible to do and learn of what's required if you are lazy and aren't dedicated enough. And I was both of those things. I tried to make a method that could help me make up for it and fix those problems. After creating the method and putting it to the test of having experience using it for years, I finally came to a conclusion that although I once had a dream to only lazy train my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and thinking I could get good or even great without working hard as much to get black belt level, when expectations meets reality, I remembered and realized that there is still a limit to everything. Even though I at least did make memorizing techniques easier for myself, but in a way, after a while of getting out of the white belt tutorial phase and feeling pretty satisfied on how far I have gotten skill-wise, at some point I realized there is a limit with this method of mine, and if I really want to reach towards to higher levels of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu of becoming skillful like a master black belt, I will have to actually be more committed and put in more physical work and effort. Again, if I ever want to be somewhat of a master at this sport someday, you can't be a master of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu with just having knowledge alone. Your skills need to be just as good. Skill is ultimately what separates high-level grapplers to the rest, especially championship levels. Memorizing techniques and lessons is a way to build knowledge. Then with that knowledge, you can start building skills. Having the knowledge of the fundamentals and basics will only get me to the starting line, and from there, now it all depends how much more effort I put in to sharpen what I know to progress into higher levels. In the end, my lazy method helped gave me direction and meaning to my training. Instead of aimlessly wandering around working on one technique and randomly moving on to the next technique, until I finally get somewhere with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, my lazy method is like my guide rails to make me feel like I am moving in the right direction in helping me build up my knowledge of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu by making it easier to memorize and organize my learning, as well as to make it so that the energy that I do spend to memorize and encode information of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques to be optimal and efficient, that I am able to get the most out of what my brain can comfortably handle. But in a broad sense, for everything I did was just to achieve better memorization in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, because I believe that the better your ability to memorize, encode, and recall information, the faster and more efficient you become to learn and acquire a skill or subject in any field. Having the ability to strongly memorize things is an advantage to help acquire more knowledge, and I find that having more knowledge can enrich more of the learning experience and enhances the mastery of new skills by making learning more structured, informed, and purposeful. And what do I mean by enriching the learning experience, especially for myself, is that by figuring a way to improve my ability to memorize knowledge by using my method had made it easier for me to seek help and learn from my peers more effectively. Cause for me, if I can't remember a piece of advice or lessons that my coach or other higher belts gives me and end up forgetting the information easily later on anyways, I feel like I am wasting my time and everyone else's time. The reasons why I used to dread on showing up to train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu at my gym or kept on quitting Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu many times before was because back then I felt like my time was not being rewarded. I didn't feel like I was spending my time in a way that was efficient or good enough whenever I was doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I just felt stupid all the time. But now things are different. This method of mine is very helpful for me when I was a beginner to help in memorizing and retain techniques that I want to learn, giving me confidence of never really having to worry about forgetting what I memorized or mistakes I made. It is a nice tool that I created and added to make my training routine drastically more efficient and effective. Well, effective enough that I am able to have an easier time and not struggle with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu like I used to before. I'll put it another way for more clarity of what I mean. The experience of learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu has become less stressful when you don't have to worry about forgetting what you just learned, and the ability to be able to comprehend and memorize so far any technique good enough to stick in my head long enough so that whenever I have time to train physically on the mats and go over the techniques with a partner or a master, that I am able to have a better time recalling and refining what I have memorized and quickly put it to practice, making my experience going to my gym to train more worthwhile and efficient. Nowadays, whenever I show up to class, I have a better time following with what's being taught in those classes. Watching other people roll has become more exciting now, cause when I watch two people roll, especially the high level ones competing, and I am just seeing them go at it, trying to submit or get points from each other. With the knowledge that I have now from building a good amount of vocabulary of techniques, I now have a better understanding of what is happening in the roll when I see it, than be left confused, bored, and blind to see the skills, strategies, and nuances of the roll with the use of this lazy method of mine. Ever since coming back to my gym again to train, I managed to have a better experience in memorizing my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu school's curriculum of about 150 fundamentals and basic techniques more quickly and easily, while only physically training about 1 or 2 times a week at my gym. But not saying I am fluent in performing them all skillfully. I just know them well enough to utilize them to get by in my rollings. At this point, I say that my foundation is not strong, but lightly moderate. But whenever I plan on finally get serious progress with my training. My next focus would be to really sharpen and work on them until they become more automatic and second nature. Really slow down and take more time to know how to deepen and improve my skills of using each and every one of them more effectively to greater levels. Over time, I learned that I can't just immediately try to understand and jump towards learning advanced Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu if my skills of the fundamentals and basics are just lightly moderate. I really need to first make my understanding and skills of them more stronger before I can approach working on more advanced stuff. To talk more about the idea of me ever wanting to go even further with my learning in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, in being so competent in the martial art of becoming a master, I first have to talk about this term called the 4 stages of competency. There is a lot to explain about this term, so I will just make it quick for the sake of this video at this point. The 4 stages of competence model is commonly attributed to Noel Birch, an employee with Gordon Training International. He developed the model in the 1970s to describe the process of learning and acquiring new skills. The model has since become widely used in various fields to help people understand the stages they go through when learning something new. The 4 stages of competence are like levels in a learning game. Here's how they work if Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was like learning how to ride a bike. First stage, unconscious incompetence. This is the first level. It's when you don't know what you don't know. Imagine trying to ride a bike but not knowing what a bike is. You don't know how to do it and you don't know what you need to learn. Second stage, conscious incompetence. This is the second level. Now you know what you don't know. You've seen a bike and tried to ride it, but you keep falling. You know you need to learn and practice more. Third stage, conscious competence. This is the third level. You're getting better. You can ride the bike, but you have to think about it a lot. You concentrate on balancing and pedaling, and you're doing it, but it still takes effort. Fourth stage, unconscious competence. This is the 4th level. Now you can ride the bike without even thinking about it. It feels easy and natural, like you've always known how to do it. So these stages help you understand how you get better at something from not knowing anything to doing it really well without even thinking about it. I would say memorizing and understanding the fundamentals and basics of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is a way to help you start getting through stage 1 of competency, to eventually knowing how to get on a 2-wheel bike and trying to figure out how to maintain balance, then eventually helping you through the second stage of competency. Then from there you can start pedaling to reach stage 3. To me, my method is like adding training wheels that help me be able to get on the bike much earlier and start riding to get to stage 3 of competency. I keep using the training wheels until I feel confident enough that I could ride without them. When I finally reach the competency of stage 3, the training wheels start to come off from the bike. Now it just depends how much and how far I want to sharpen those fundamentals and basic techniques, and how much effort and commitment I put into advance riding the bike to reach stage 4. At this point, I believe that I am somewhere in stage 3 and have been in a way pretty satisfied of being there so far. But again, if I were to pursue in reaching stage 4 of competency, how would I do that? Well, I might have to take the rite of passage to help achieve that next phase, because even though I avoided taking the rite of passage route by using my lazy method instead as a way to help build my foundation and get out of the white belt phase more easier from where I was stuck at, when it comes to the pursuit of building skill in being purple belt level and higher, I don't think I can reach towards those levels with just my lazy method and some kinesthetic learning alone. If I ever want to dream to reach having my skills of becoming black belt level, I would need to definitely put in more work, effort, focus, and time to improve my skills to get to that point. One day, I will try to push towards to that next level. And in order to do that, I need to show up to my gym more often to train in the ideal environment that I can thrive more effectively in. I need to constantly be challenged challenged or critiqued by very skilled and talented people. And I need to constantly put in the work and focus that is worthy to be a black belt. And that's what taking the rite of passage of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is really all about. But for now, as long as I know the gist of all of those techniques in my head and still be able to utilize them well enough to get decent amount of taps in my rolls and still have fun, I don't have to worry much about my current level for now and can feel confident that I can always improve the skills of using them more in the future when the time comes. At this moment, I can still be satisfied being just an on and off casual player. I always say, what's the point of doing something if you are not going to be consistent with it? You're not determined or committed enough to make time for it. It's like your goal is to build muscle, but you only work out once a month. That is not really going to get you anywhere. And what would be the point in doing that in the first place? Might as well just not work out at all, and it wouldn't really make a difference to your progress. That was how I felt about learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques. What was the point of learning them if I was going to forget them quickly right after? I was just not consistent enough to show up to my gym to follow up in learning those techniques. The main reason is that I was too lazy to do what was traditionally required to build paths in my knowledge for them to go anywhere to be useful. But now with my lazy method, building those paths to learning those techniques have become very much less of a hassle, less of a mental exhaustion, and more convenient for me to do. The experience of using this method is like, for every new technique I memorize, it is like I am quickly building a new path with ease. Although the path may not be clean, smooth, and perfect at first, but at least I have a path to take to get to the answer on how to execute a technique, than to have no path at all. And eventually over time, the more I try to use or review those techniques when I physically train at the gym on the mats, I am able to constantly update, improve, and refine those paths more and more each time I physically train until they become closer to perfect or ideal. That the way that I perform them becomes reliable, fluid, quick, and strong to be used in any given situations that I may find myself in, whether it's rolling or competing. But overall, my method is somewhat my way to passively and quickly memorize a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu technique without feeling stressed out. It basically does the heavy lifting when it comes to the memorization aspect of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It helped me to finally get a sense of feeling more confident in my ability to learn Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and give me a sense of control in my progression. That again, if I ever do become very committed enough to try to take the rite of passage, it will be an overall better and less stressful experience and process to do. I believe that my method can still play a part somewhere to help me get to that next level going towards black belt more effectively and efficiently that works best for me. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to me is like a language, and the techniques are the vocabulary words. If I can make my life easier to learn the language by making it more easier to memorize a whole bunch of the vocabulary words that is needed, then learning a language like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu becomes less complicated, less of a hassle, and more of a funner experience when I finally get to practice speaking that language with another person. And being in the stage of practice is the most important thing. It is when you can sharpen up pronouncing the words, try to form sentences, and fix any mistakes you make when physically communicating. Or to put it in a less metaphorical way, when you finally reach to a level of having enough foundational knowledge built, it overall makes the process easier for, say, a master, especially taking those one-on-one privates, for a master to have a better experience to effectively help you refine and fix any mistakes with the way you perform the techniques. I feel like back then, I've been stuck in the stage of not being able to reach the practice stage of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for a while because of my struggles with memorizing the vocabulary of techniques and lack of commitment to do traditionally of what's required. But this method of mine helped me get to that stage in a way that worked best for me. Right now, currently, I haven't physically trained much the past year of 2023 and 2024. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Jiu-Jitsu has not really been my focus because of a lot of things that are currently changing and happening in my life so far. These past 2 years especially has been drastically an on and off thing with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but I would say that thanks to memorizing those fundamentals and basics from my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu gym and establishing a somewhat moderate foundation, I can confidently say that even if I stopped doing Jiu-Jitsu for a year or more to go traveling or something, I think my understanding and knowledge of the fundamentals and basics is ingrained enough that whenever I do come back to train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu again, hopefully the next time around I can be more serious and consistent with it when I come back. But while on break, that I don't really have to worry about my skills and knowledge wavering or falling back to complete zero like a newbie white belt. But instead, I am reassured and confident in knowing that I can always fall back on being able to remember and pull out those fundamentals and basics to help quickly work my way back up to leveling my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu skills without any difficulty. Climb a giant hill once, the second time you do it, it is easier. Plus, I have my method as double reinsurance that I won't forget. There was a time I made the mistakes of going into the rabbit hole of memorizing a bunch of techniques from YouTube, Instagram, just a lot of those cool looking techniques. But to be honest, I feel like memorizing all of those fundamentals and basic techniques of my school is really all I need. Once I finally memorized the gist of all of them, I kinda didn't need to use my method as much anymore. At that point, I felt that I had enough in my arsenal to branch off from because of how effective learning those fundamentals and basics were. Thank you to Coach Jay and the people at the academy for constantly and painfully reminding me to keep focus on them. Now, to conclude one more thing before the end of this video. If I weren't lazy and instead actually dedicated of putting effort into training Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, if I had to go back in time to when I first started training Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and choose which path to take in my training, I wouldn't take the path to do this method of mine and would just instead train every day at my gym of traditionally taking the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu rite of passage, of doing what I am supposed to do in order to become eventually a high-level grappler. And I just wish that was the case, to be honest. But again, going back to reality, I was and currently still now just not that type of person. I could be in the future, but right now I am a lazy human and just want to be able to get good enough to have fun in the sport. And if that is the case, then in order to just get to that kind of goal, I find that using my lazy method fits the bill because it made training Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu be more flexible, easier to do, and doesn't require making too much sacrifices that it takes to get to that point. This is why I created and prefer doing this method of mine instead when I was in my white belt phase. Overall, I enjoyed and feel proud of my transformation from going from the least productive Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner to the kind of productive Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner at my gym. But if I ever start to get serious in my training to pursue a higher level in the future, trying to master Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is still going to be difficult leading on from here. So hopefully I can be prepared one day to finally put more effort and dedication to my training to actually progress in becoming an amazing grappler. But that's finally it for this video. Let me know in the comments below of what you think of my method or way to memorize techniques, cause it is good to get feedback on what people think on my approach to learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. If you have your own creative way that you use in learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, or just have a better solution for a lazy person like me, let me know. Alright, please subscribe and I will see you in the next video.